Dry Creek sat on the edge of the territory like a mistake God had made and then forgotten to wipe away. It was a wind-scoured collection of timber and grit in the 1870s. A place where the main street was nothing more than two ruts worn deep into the red earth by wagon wheels and ambition. The wind here did not blow. It scoured. It stripped the paint from the false front buildings and drove the red dust into the very pores of the men and women who were foolish enough to call this place home. To the west, the mountains rose up like bruised knuckles against a sky that was too big and too blue to be comforting. To the east, the prairie rolled out endlessly, a sea of scrub brush and buffalo grass that hissed when the breeze picked up. The air smelled of sage, horse sweat, and the coppery tang of drying blood from the slaughterhouse at the edge of town. It was a beautiful, cruel land, indifferent to whether a man lived or died, demanding a price for every breath drawn. In the cramped back room of Miller's General Store, Maggie O'Rourke paid that price one stitch at a time. The air in the small room was stale, heavy with the scent of lint and kerosene. A single oil lamp cast a yellow, flickering circle of light over the sewing machine that hummed beneath her fingers. Her back ached, a dull, throbbing knot between her shoulder blades that never seemed to loosen. But she did not stop. She could not afford to stop. The dress beneath the needle was a frivolous thing. Yellow silk meant for the banker's wife, a woman who had never known a day of hunger in her life. Maggie guided the fabric with hands that were red and roughened from scrubbing floors and chopping kindling. Her eyes burned. It was late, past the hour when decent folk were asleep, but the debt her father had left behind did not sleep, and neither did the hunger in the bellies of her younger brother and sister. The rhythmic clatter of the machine was the only sound in the room, but in the silence of her mind, other sounds intruded, sometimes, when the fatigue was heavy enough to lower her guard. She could still hear the heavy slide of a barn door closing. She could smell the sour mash whiskey on a man's breath and feel the crushing weight of a hand on her wrist. It had been 3 years since that night in Silas Harper's barn. She had gone there to deliver a mended saddle blanket. Nothing more. Silas had been waiting. The town remembered it differently. Of course, they remembered the shouting, her torn dress as she ran out, and Silas standing in the doorway, laughing, smoothing his hair, calling her a liar. They whispered that she had gone there looking for favors and had cried wolf when she didn't get the coin she wanted. "No," she whispered to the empty room, the word harsh in her throat. She had fought, she had screamed, and she had survived. But survival in Dry Creek was a lonely business. The shame, though it did not belong to her, had been plastered onto her skin like mud that would not wash off. Respectable women crossed the street to avoid walking in her shadow. They lowered their voices when she passed, their fans fluttering like nervous birds. Even the ones who hired her to sew their Sunday best would not meet her eyes when they dropped off the fabric, treating her as something necessary but unclean. Maggie finished the hem and bit the thread, the taste of cotton sharp on her tongue. She folded the yellow silk carefully. They called her bold. They called her trouble. Let them talk. Talk did not put flour in the bin or medicine in the spoon for her brother's cough. Outside, the muffled rhythm of hooves on packed earth announced the arrival of a drive. The dust would be rising now, choking the moonlight. Elijah Kane rode at the drag of the small herd, swallowing the grit that the cattle kicked up. He sat his horse with the easy, boneless grace of a man who had spent more of his life in the saddle than on his feet. He was a quiet man, built of long lines and hard angles, with a face that gave nothing away. A pale, jagged scar ran the length of his left forearm, a souvenir from a skirmish in a war that felt like it had happened to a different man in a different lifetime. He worked for the Harper Ranch, branding Silas Harper's calves and driving Silas Harper's beef to railheads. But he belonged to no one. He kept his distance from the big house and the man who lived in it. Eli preferred the company of horses. They were honest beasts who told you exactly what they were thinking before they kicked you. He guided the last of the stragglers into the holding pens near the rail line, the cattle lowing their complaints into the night. When the work was done and the horses settled, Eli walked toward the glowing windows of the Tin Star Saloon. Not for the company, but to wash the dust from his throat. The saloon was loud, a wall of noise that hit him as he pushed through the swinging doors. Tobacco smoke hung in a blue haze near the ceiling. Men leaned against the bar, their laughter raucous and sharp. Eli found a spot at the far end of the polished wood and ordered a whiskey. He drank it slow, staring into the amber liquid, trying to shut out the noise. But voices carried. Down the bar, a group of cowhands from the Double T were deep in their cups. One of them, a loudmouth drift rider named Bates, slapped the counter. "You hear about that gelding Harper hired?" Bates brayed, jerking a thumb vaguely in Eli's direction, though he didn't realize Eli was within earshot. "Big fellow. Looks like he could wrestle a steer, don't he?" The other men laughed. A cruel, wet sound. "Don't let the size fool you," Bates went on, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial rasp that carried perfectly across the room. "I heard tell about him from a fella down in Texas. Said Kane was engaged to a preacher's girl. Pretty little thing. But on the wedding night? Nothing." The men hooted. "Nothing. Limp as a wet rope." Bates crowed. She ran out crying. Said he couldn't please a woman if his life hung on it. Said there was something dead inside him. The laughter that followed was dark and ugly. The sound of men confirming their own virility by stripping it from another. Eli's hand tightened around his glass. The knuckles turned white, the scar on his arm pulsing with a phantom ache. He stared straight ahead at the row of bottles behind the bar. He could turn around. He could put Bates through the mirror with 2 punches. It would be easy. It would feel good. But it would change nothing. He finished his drink, set the glass down with a precise click, and turned to walk out. As he passed the group, the laughter died in their throats. Bates looked up, his face draining of color as he met Eli's eyes. Eli looked at him for a long heartbeat, his gaze flat and dark as a mine shaft. He said nothing. He didn't have to. He simply pushed through the doors and stepped back into the night. He walked until the noise of the saloon faded, ending up on the ridge overlooking the town. The sun had long since gone, but the moon was bright, painting the prairie in shades of silver and charcoal. He sat on a flat rock and took off his hat, running a hand through his hair. The wind was cold, but he welcomed it. The story Bates told was the same one that had followed him for 5 years, mutating and growing with every mile he put between himself and Texas. The truth was a quieter, sharper pain. He closed his eyes and saw her face. Sarah. She had been 18, the preacher's daughter, with eyes that were always wide with a vague, trembling fear. She had been terrified of him, terrified of the marriage bed, terrified of the blood and the pain her mother had whispered about. On their wedding night, she had recoiled from his touch, shaking so hard her teeth rattled. Eli had looked at her, huddled in the corner of the bed, weeping, and he had felt a monstrous wave of protectiveness and shame. He couldn't force her. He couldn't be the brute she expected. So he had stepped back. He had slept on the floor. And when her father had found out the marriage wasn't consummated, the man had thundered about annulment, about fraud, to save herself from the shame of being a wife who wouldn't be a wife. Sarah had let her father scream that the fault lay with Eli. She had looked at the ground and let the lie stand. "He isn't a man," her father had shouted. "He is incapable." Eli had taken the blame. It was the only gift he could give her. He had saddled his horse and ridden north, letting the lie chase him like a pack of wolves. He opened his eyes and looked down at the sleeping town of Dry Creek. He was 32 years old, and he was tired. Tired of the loneliness. Tired of the whispers. Tired of being a man defined by a thing he hadn't done. The next afternoon, the heat lay over the main street like a wool blanket. Maggie stepped out of the general store. A heavy bolt of calico cloth balanced on her shoulder. It was awkward, weighing nearly 20 pounds, and the dust made the boardwalk slick. She stumbled, the heel of her boot catching on a loose plank. She grabbed a hitching post to steady herself, the bolt sliding dangerously. Across the street, 3 teenage boys were whittling on a bench. They saw her stumble and snickered. "Careful there," "Maggie!" one shouted. "Don't want to fall on your back again. It's a habit, ain't it?" The others laughed, the sound sharp and cruel in the hot air. Maggie's face burned. She gripped the cloth tighter, her knuckles white, and tried to right herself, but the weight was dragging her down. Suddenly, the weight vanished. Large, gloved hands lifted the bolt from her shoulder with effortless ease. Maggie flinched, stepping back, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked up. Eli Kane stood there, holding the heavy roll of fabric as if it were made of feathers. He wasn't looking at the boys. He was looking at her. He wore a dusty hat pulled low, shadowing his eyes, but she could see the color of them, a deep slate gray, calm and unhurried. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "You look like you could use a hand." He didn't smile. He didn't leer. He didn't look at her bodice or her mouth. He simply held the cloth, waiting. Maggie smoothed her apron, her hands trembling slightly. She was used to men looking at her. Since the rumors about the barn started, men looked at her with one of two things in their eyes: hungry speculation or righteous disgust. They either wanted to use her or stone her. Eli Kane looked at her with neither. He looked at her as if she were simply a person standing in the sun who needed help carrying a heavy load. It was the most unsettling thing that had happened to her in years. "Thank you, Mr. Kane," she said, her voice stiff. She didn't meet his eyes, afraid of what she might see if she looked too long. "I can manage. I'm headed your way," he said. "It's no trouble." He fell into step beside her, keeping a respectful distance of 2 feet between them. He didn't try to make conversation. He just walked, shielding her from the street with his broad shoulders. The boys on the bench fell silent as they passed, cowed by Eli's size and the quiet menace that seemed to radiate from him. They reached the small, weathered house at the end of the street where she lived. It was a sad little structure, the paint peeling, the fence leaning drunkenly to the left, but there were geraniums in pots by the door, fighting to bloom against the dust. Eli set the cloth down on the porch swing. "Thank you," Maggie said again, risking a glance at him. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." He turned and walked away, his boots making no sound in the dust. Maggie watched him go, a strange flutter in her chest that she ruthlessly crushed. Kindness was dangerous. Kindness usually came with a bill of sale attached. She went inside, the house cool and dim. A coughing fit greeted her from the back room. "Jamie," she called out, dropping her shawl. Her brother, 10 years old and thin as a reed, was sitting up in bed, his face flushed. Her sister, 6-year-old Clara, was huddled next to him, reading from a tattered primer. "He's coughing again." "Maggie," Clara whispered, her eyes wide. Maggie went to the basin, poured water, and brought a cup to the boy. "Drink, Jamie." Slow now. The water soothed him, but the rattle in his chest was deep. It was the dust, the dry air. The doctor had said he needed rest and good food, beef broth and milk, all of which cost money. Money she didn't have. Her father had died 6 months ago, leaving behind a legacy of bad poker hands and signed markers. The biggest marker was held by Silas Harper. The rent on this house was overdue by 2 months. The landlord, a nervous man named Mr. Henderson, who jumped when Silas Harper sneezed, had told her yesterday that if she didn't pay by the first snow, they would be out, and winter was coming. She could feel it in the sharpening wind. A heavy knock on the front door made her jump. It wasn't the polite rap of a neighbor. It was the demand of an owner. Maggie smoothed her hair, told the children to stay quiet, and went to the door. Silas Harper stood on the porch. He was a handsome man in a serpentine way, with silver threading his dark hair and a suit that cost more than Maggie would earn in 5 lifetimes. His boots were polished to a high shine, free of the dust that coated everything else in Dry Creek. Behind him, leaning against the porch rail, was Sheriff Miller, looking bored and complicit. "Maggie," Silas said, smiling. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "May I come in? I'd rather you didn't." "Silas," she said, standing in the doorway, blocking his path. "Now, Is that any way to treat an old friend? He pushed past her gently but firmly, forcing her to step back or be touched. He walked into her small parlor, looking around with an air of amused contempt. He touched the worn fabric of her armchair. I spoke with Henderson today, Silas said, turning to face her. He tells me you're behind on the rent. Again. And I know for a fact your father's debt to me stands at $400. I'm paying it, Maggie said, her chin lifting. I pay $5 every week. Silas laughed softly. At that rate, you'll be free of debt in about 80 years, if you live that long. And if the boy doesn't get sicker, Maggie went cold. Leave my brother out of this. Silas stepped closer. The smell of bay rum and fine tobacco filled her nose, choking her. I'm a reasonable man. Maggie, I hate to see a pretty woman struggle. I could make this all go away. The debt, the rent, I could see to it that the boy sees a specialist in Denver. Maggie stared at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. And what is the price? Silas? He reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. She froze, fighting the urge to vomit. We have unfinished business. You and I, he murmured. The town already thinks you're mine. Why not make it true? You give me a few nights a week, here, quietly, and the debts vanish. We can call it a settlement for the misunderstanding in the barn. Maggie slapped his hand away. Her breath came in short, angry gasps. Get out! Silas's face hardened. The charm evaporated, leaving something reptilian behind. You're playing a dangerous game. Maggie, you have nothing. No money, no family to protect you, no reputation. Who is going to help you? Get out, she hissed, backing toward the kitchen where the knife blocks sat. Silas stared at her for a long moment, then shrugged, adjusting his cuffs. Think about it. First snow is coming. Maggie, it gets cold out on the prairie without a roof. He turned and walked out, the sheriff trailing him like an obedient dog. Maggie slammed the door and locked it, then leaned her forehead against the wood, shaking uncontrollably. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the tears. She would not cry. Silas Harper would not make her cry. Outside, in the deepening shadows of the alley beside the house, Eli Kane stood perfectly still. He had been coming to check on the loose fence post he had noticed earlier. A foolish excuse to see her again. He had heard the voices through the thin walls. He had heard the quiver of terror in Maggie's voice and the oily menace in Silas's. Eli felt a cold, quiet rage settling in his gut, heavier than lead. He looked at his hands. They were big hands, scarred and calloused. Hands that knew how to work, how to shoot, how to break things. But for 5 years, he had kept them to himself. He had kept his head down, believing that if he just did his work and stayed silent, he could outrun his shame. But standing there in the dark, listening to the wind howl across the plains, Eli realized that silence wasn't safety. Silence was permission. By doing nothing, by saying nothing, he was letting men like Silas Harper eat the world alive. He looked at the closed door of Maggie's house. He remembered the way her hands had shaken when she held the bolt of cloth. He remembered the fierce, terrified pride in her eyes. He turned and walked back toward the bunkhouse, but his stride was different now. The indecision was gone. The next morning, Eli appeared at the back door of the general store. Maggie was sweeping the stoop, her movements jerky and angry. When she saw him, she stiffened, clutching the broom like a weapon. Mr. Kane, she said, her voice guarding a bruise. Miss O'Rourke, he said, removing his hat. I noticed yesterday your fence is leaning, and that woodpile of yours is getting low. Maggie blinked. Yes, I haven't had time. I have some time, Eli said. I'd like to see to it for you. Maggie narrowed her eyes. Why? I can't pay you. Mr. Kane, I have no money for hired help. I don't want money, Eli said calmly. You stitched a shirt for me last month. Did a good job. The buttons haven't popped yet. Let's call it a trade. It was a lie. He had paid her for the shirt. Full price. Maggie knew it. She looked at him, searching for the trick, the trap, but there was only the steady, gray gaze and the open sky behind him. If you want to waste your time on a broken fence. I won't stop you, she said finally. But I have no lemonade to offer you, And no coin. Water will do fine. Ma'am. For the next 3 days, Eli Kane became a fixture in Maggie's yard. He came after his shift at the ranch ended, working until the sun went down. He fixed the fence, replacing the rotted posts with fresh cedar. He repaired the broken step on the porch that had been threatening to snap for a year. He chopped a cord of wood, his axe rising and falling with a rhythmic, hypnotic thwack-crack that echoed through the neighborhood. Maggie watched him through the window as she sewed. She saw the way he worked, methodical, patient, not wasting a single motion. She saw the sweat soak through his shirt, plastering the fabric to his broad back. She also saw him with the children. On the second day, Jamie wandered out to the woodpile, wrapped in a blanket. Maggie started to call him back, but she stopped. Eli had paused in his chopping. He didn't shoo the boy away. He knelt down, bringing himself to Jamie's eye level. He picked up a piece of pine and pulled a whittling knife from his pocket. Maggie couldn't hear what they were saying, but she saw Jamie's eyes light up. 20 minutes later, Jamie came inside holding a roughly carved horse, coughing but smiling for the first time in weeks. He says he's seen wild horses, Jamie rasped, clutching the wooden toy. He says they run faster than the wind. Maggie looked out the window. Eli was back to chopping wood, his face set in grim concentration. On the third evening, the wind changed. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour, the air smelling of ice and iron. Winter was knocking. Eli was stacking the last of the wood. Maggie came out onto the porch, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She held a cup of coffee, the steam rising in the cold air. "Mr. Kane," she said. He turned, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "Ma'am," she held out the cup. "It's fresh." He took it, his fingers brushing hers. His skin was rough, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "Thank you." He took a sip, looking out at the darkening horizon. "Storm coming." "Yes," Maggie said softly. "A big one." Eli looked at her. He set the cup down on the railing. "I heard about the debt." Maggie went rigid. The softness vanished. "I don't know what you mean. I know Silas holds the paper on this house," Eli said, his voice low. "I know he aims to put you out if you don't pay. It's none of your business," she snapped, turning to go inside. "It ain't," he agreed. "But I'm making it mine." She stopped, her hand on the doorknob. "Why? What is it to you? Are you looking for a bargain too? Did you hear the stories and think maybe you could get a discount on the damaged goods?" The bitterness in her voice was like acid. Eli didn't flinch. "I don't listen to stories. Maggie, you know that." She turned back to him, tears of rage and exhaustion pricking her eyes. "Then what do you want?" "I have nothing left. Eli, I have $400 of debt, a sick brother, and a reputation that's in the mud. I have nothing to give you." "I have a cabin," Eli said. "It ain't much. It's about 10 miles out, on a patch of land my daddy staked before the war. It has a good roof. It has a fireplace that draws well." Maggie stared at him, confused. "I don't understand. I have a job." Eli went on, as if he were listing the inventory of a store. "I have some savings, not a fortune, but enough to pay off the rent arrears and buy medicine. I plan to start my own herd come spring." He took a step closer. He took off his hat, holding it in both hands. The wind ruffled his dark hair. "The town talks about me. Maggie, you know what they say. They say I ain't a whole man. They say I can't be a husband to a woman." Maggie swallowed. "I've heard." Eli looked her dead in the eye. The shame was there, deep in his gaze, but he didn't look away. "I'm offering you a trade, Maggie, a real one. I need a wife to hold a claim and build a life. You need a roof and protection from Silas Harper." The world seemed to stop spinning. The only sound was the wind rattling the dry leaves of the geraniums. Are you proposing marriage?" she whispered. Eli nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. "I am." He didn't speak of love. He didn't speak of desire. He spoke of survival. "If you marry me, Silas can't touch you. The law says a wife's debts become her husband's responsibility. He'll have to deal with me, and I won't let him near you." Maggie stared at him. She saw the scar on his arm, the lines of fatigue around his eyes, and the terrifying, beautiful solidity of him. She thought of Silas Harper's hands. She thought of the winter coming. She thought of the rumors that he was impotent, broken, useless in bed. A strange, hysterical thought crossed her mind. If the rumors are true, I will be safe from him too. But looking at the way his shoulders filled his shirt, looking at the heat that seemed to radiate from him even in the cold air, she wasn't sure. Why? She asked again, her voice shaking. Why would you take on my trouble? Eli looked past her, toward the window where Jamie and Clara were watching. Because nobody should have to fight a war alone, he said softly, and I'm tired of running away. He looked back at her, his face open and vulnerable in a way she had never seen a man be. I can't promise you fancy things. Maggie, I can't promise the town will stop talking. But I can promise you'll never be cold, and you'll never be hungry, and you'll never be afraid of the man in your house. He waited. The sun had dipped below the horizon, turning the sky a bruised purple. The first flake of snow drifted down, white and silent, landing on the brim of his hat. Maggie O'Rourke looked at the cowboy who the world said was less than a man. She took a breath that tasted of snow and wood smoke. She released the doorknob. Come inside. Eli, she said, we have things to discuss. The lamplight flickered in the draft from the open door, casting long, dancing shadows against the peeling wallpaper of Maggie O'Rourke's small parlor. She stood gripping the doorframe, her knuckles white, staring at the man who had just offered to save her life by ending it, or at least, ending the life she had thought she might one day have. Eli Kane stood on the porch, his hat in his hands, the snow beginning to dust his shoulders like fine sugar. He was as still as a mountain and just as unreadable. Maggie's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The proposal hung in the cold air between them, heavy and absurd. Marriage. To Eli Kane. To the man the entire town of Dry Creek whispered about behind their hands. The man who, they said, was not really a man at all. Her mind raced, a chaotic stampede of fear and logic. She heard the echo of the church ladies, their voices dripping with faux sympathy. Poor Mr. Kane, a fine worker, but useless as a breeding bull. She'd heard the coarse laughter from the saloon that drifted down the street on Saturday nights, men joking about the bride who had run from his bed in tears. If she said yes, she would be tying herself to a laughing-stock. She would be the wife of the gelding. But then the image of Silas Harper rose in her mind, his polished boots, the smell of his bay rum, the terrifying weight of his hand on her wrist in the barn 3 years ago. I can make this all go away, he had said. The threat was not just to her virtue, it was to her survival. It was to Jamie's lungs and Clara's empty belly. Silas would take the house. He would put them on the street in the dead of winter, or he would force her into his bed as payment for a roof. She looked at Eli again. He had not moved. He did not look like a man who would force anyone to do anything. He looked like a man who understood the weight of a burden. The thought struck her, sharp and sudden. If the rumors were true, if Eli Kane truly had no desire for a woman, if he was incapable of the act that men seemed to prize above all else, then she would be safe. There would be no grasping hands in the dark, no demands she could not refuse. It would be a partnership of labor, a business arrangement sealed with a ring. Comforting. And yet, beneath the relief, a small, treacherous part of her felt a chill. To be a wife in name only, to never know the tenderness that the poets wrote about, the kind her mother had once whispered of before the hard years wore her down. Maggie stepped back, opening the door wider. Come in, Mr. Kane, she said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. You will freeze if you stay out there. Eli stepped over the threshold, bringing the smell of cold air and pine resin with him. He wiped his boots carefully on the rag rug, a gesture of respect that Silas Harper would never have bothered with. Maggie gestured to the worn armchair. Please, sit. He sat on the edge of the chair, his hat resting on his knee. The room seemed suddenly smaller with him in it. He was a big man, broad through the chest and shoulders, his legs long and clad in denim that had seen many miles of saddle leather. "You are serious," she said. It was not a question. "I am," Eli answered. His voice was a low rumble, steady as the earth. "I have nothing to bring to a marriage. Eli, my father's debts are my dowry. My siblings are my burden. You know this, I know it, and you know what people say about me, that I led Silas on, that I am spoiled goods." Eli's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "That is why I'm here, Maggie, because I know a lie when I hear one." Maggie walked to the window, staring out at the falling snow. She needed to ask. She needed to know the landscape of the terrain she was about to cross. She turned back to him, crossing her arms over her chest as if to hold herself together. "And I have heard the lies about you, Eli, or the truths. I do not know which they are." Eli looked down at his hat, his fingers tracing the brim. He did not speak. "They say," she continued, her voice tight and high, forcing the words out before she lost her courage, "that you could not please your first wife. They say she left you on your wedding night because you could not do what a husband does." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. The fire popped in the grate, a loud crack that made Maggie flinch. Eli looked up. His eyes were dark, swirling with old pain, but he did not look away. He did not look angry. He looked tired. "Sarah was young," he said softly. "Younger than you. She was the preacher's girl, raised to think the body was a sin. On our wedding night, she was shaking so hard the bed frame rattled. She was crying before I even touched her." He paused, looking at his large, scarred hands. "I could have forced her. The law would have been on my side. Her father would have told me it was my right. But I looked at her, terrified and small, and I couldn't do it. I didn't know how to talk her out of her fear, and I wouldn't break her to satisfy myself. So I walked away." Maggie felt the breath leave her lungs in a long, slow exhale. She told her father it was my fault. Eli continued. "It was the only way to save her pride. Better to be married to a man who isn't a man than to be a wife who failed her duty. I let her tell it. It didn't matter to me what they thought." He looked at Maggie then, his gaze piercing. "I feared hurting her more than I feared their laughter." Maggie stared at him. She saw the truth of it written in the lines of his face. He wasn't broken. He wasn't incapable. He was gentle. In a world of violent men. In a town where strength was measured by how hard a man could hit or how much he could take. Eli Kane had chosen mercy at the cost of his own name. Something inside Maggie's chest, a tight knot of fear she had carried for 3 years, began to loosen. It was a dangerous feeling. It was the feeling of hope. She walked to the table and sat opposite him. "If I agree to this," she said, her voice steady now, "what are the terms?" Eli sat up straighter. "I have the cabin. It has 4 walls and a roof that doesn't leak. I have 40 acres of scrub and grass, but it has water. I aim to build a herd. It will be hard work, Maggie, sun up to sundown. You'll have to cook and clean and maybe help with the calves in the spring. I am not afraid of work," she said. "I know. That is why I asked you. And Jamie and Clara, there is a loft in the cabin. It will be tight, but warm. I can hunt. We won't starve. And Silas won't cross my fence line." Maggie looked at the scar on his forearm, shining pale in the lamplight. "And us?" she asked. The question hung there, unspoken but loud. Eli looked at her mouth, then back to her eyes. "I won't ask for anything you aren't willing to give. Maggie, we can be partners. We can be friends. I just want to build something that lasts." Maggie closed her eyes for a moment. She weighed the known terror of Silas against the unknown life with Eli. She weighed the shame of the town against the quiet dignity of the man sitting before her. She opened her eyes. "Yes," she said. Eli blinked, as if he hadn't expected her to agree so quickly. "Yes, I will marry you. Eli Kane, I will keep your house and I will help you build your herd, and I will not let anyone speak ill of you in my hearing again." Eli stood up. He looked overwhelmed, as if he had braced himself for a blow and received a gift instead. He held out his hand. "It's a deal, then." Maggie stood and placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, dry, and engulfing. It felt like safety. The news tore through Dry Creek faster than a prairie fire. By noon the next day, everyone from the blacksmith to the schoolteacher knew that Maggie O'Rourke was marrying the eunuch Cowboy. The reaction was exactly what Maggie had feared, only sharper. When she went to the mercantile to buy thread for her wedding dress, Mrs. Gable turned her back on her. Two women by the pickle barrel whispered loudly enough for her to hear. "Well, at least she won't have to worry about the sin of lust," one tittered. "She found the only man in the territory who won't want her," the other replied. "A match made in purgatory, if you ask me." Maggie kept her chin high, her spine stiff as a ramrod. But the words stung like nettles. She purchased her thread with the last of her coins and walked out, refusing to let them see her bleed. In the saloon, the men were less subtle. They placed bets on the bar, whiskey and silver dollars wagered on how long it would take before Maggie ran off with a drummer or a real hand. They laughed when Eli walked past the Batwing doors, making crude gestures that made Maggie's face burn when she heard of them later. But she had made her choice. The wedding was set for 3 days later. There was no time for vanity. Maggie pulled an old dress from her trunk, one she had sewn for a rancher's daughter who had died of fever before she could wear it. It was a simple thing, gray wool with a bit of white lace at the collar. She let it out at the waist and hemmed it up, pricking her fingers until they bled, stitching her future into the seams. The preacher, Reverend Thomas, had been reluctant. He had hemmed and hawed in his study, polishing his spectacles, talking about the sanctity of the union and the importance of being sure. "It is a hasty arrangement," he had said, looking down his nose at Eli. "Are you certain, Mr. Kane, that you are fit for the duties of a husband?" Eli had stood in the center of the Reverend's study, filling the room with his presence. He had looked the small man in the eye until the Reverend looked away. "It is my choice, Reverend," Eli had said, his voice like grinding stones. "And it is hers. Will you marry us, or do I need to find a judge?" The Reverend had agreed. The ceremony took place behind the church, in the small, dusty yard, where the wind whipped around the corners of the building. It was a gray, blustery afternoon. The sky was the color of a bruise. There were no flowers. Jamie and Clara stood by Maggie's side, shivering in their coats, looking wide-eyed and solemn. A few townsfolk had gathered, mostly out of morbid curiosity, standing back near the fence like crows waiting for a carcass. Maggie felt a strange sense of unreality as she stood there. The wind tugged at her skirts. The smell of horse manure and dry grass filled her nose. She looked at Eli. He wore his best suit, a black frock coat that was tied across the shoulders, and a clean white shirt. He looked solemn, terrified, and handsome in a severe way. "Do you, Elijah Kane, take this woman?" "I do," Eli said. "Do you, Margaret O'Rourke?" "I do," Maggie said. Her voice did not shake, though her hands did. Eli reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. It was plain gold, thin and simple. He took her hand. His fingers were trembling. The vibration traveled through her skin, a current of shared fear. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "I now pronounce you man and wife." There was no kiss. The Reverend did not suggest it, and neither Eli nor Maggie moved to initiate one. They simply stood there, hands clasped, while the wind howled around them. They held a small reception at the boarding house, mostly because Maggie refused to slink away in the dark. She spent her last few dollars on punch and a seed cake. The guests were few, and they did not stay long. They ate the cake, murmured stiff congratulations, and left with backward glances. The air in the room was thick with awkwardness. Just as the last guest was leaving, the door opened. Silas Harper stood there. The room went silent. Silas didn't take off his hat. He leaned against the doorframe, his eyes moving slowly from Eli to Maggie. He looked at the ring on her finger, and his lip curled in a sneer that was more dangerous than a shout. "Congratulations," Silas said. His voice was smooth, oily. "I suppose every pot finds a lid, even the cracked ones." Eli stepped in front of Maggie. He didn't speak. He just stood there, a wall between his wife and the man who wanted to own her. Silas chuckled. He tipped his hat to Maggie. Good luck, Mrs. Kane. You'll need it. The winters are long out at the old Kane place, very long and very cold. He turned and left, the threat hanging in the air like smoke. Eli turned to Maggie. Are you ready? Yes, she said. Let's go. They loaded her trunk and the children's few belongings into Eli's wagon. Jamie and Clara were to stay with Mrs. Gable for 2 days, a kindness paid for with Maggie's sewing so that the newlyweds could settle in. Maggie climbed onto the wagon seat beside Eli. He clicked his tongue to the team of mules, and the wagon lurched forward. They drove down the main street of Dry Creek, past the saloon where the piano was already plinking out a tinny tune, past the general store, and out into the vast, darkening prairie. The sun was setting, a spectacular violence of red and gold bleeding across the western horizon. The mountains were purple silhouettes against the fire of the sky, but as they drove, the colors faded to gray. Silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. It wasn't the comfortable silence of old friends. It was the tense silence of strangers who have just bound their lives together. Maggie looked at Eli's profile. He was staring straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the mule's ears. He looked grim. She wondered what he was thinking. Was he regretting it? Was he thinking of the money he had spent? The burden he had taken on? The wind picked up as they drove. The temperature plummeted. By the time they were 5 miles out, the sky had turned a solid, angry slate. Clouds boiled over the peaks, rolling across the plains like a dark tide. Storm's moving fast, Eli said, the first words he had spoken in an hour. Will we beat it? Maggie asked, pulling her shawl tighter. We'll try. He snapped the reins, urging the mules into a trot. The wagon bounced and groaned over the rutted track. They didn't beat it. The rain hit them 2 miles from the cabin, cold and stinging, turning the dust of the road into slick, sucking mud. The wind tore at Maggie's bonnet. She huddled into her coat, shivering. Eli drove with one hand, reaching behind the seat to grab a canvas tarp. Here, he shouted over the wind. Cover yourself. He draped it over her, shielding her from the worst of it, while he sat exposed, the rain soaking his coat in minutes. Maggie watched him, touched by the small act of protection. They arrived at the cabin in the pitch dark. The rain now mixed with sleet. It was a small structure, logs chinked with mud, standing alone in a sea of wet grass. Eli jumped down, his boots squelching in the mud. He helped Maggie down, his hand strong on her waist. Run inside, he said. I'll see to the team. Maggie pushed open the heavy wooden door and stumbled inside. It was pitch black and freezing. She stood there, dripping, smelling the damp earth floor and the soot of the cold fireplace. She waited, her teeth chattering. It felt like a long time before the door opened again and Eli came in, carrying her trunk on one shoulder as if it weighed nothing. He kicked the door shut against the wind. He set the trunk down and moved through the darkness with the familiarity of long habit. A match flared, a brief spark of sulfur, and then the glow of a lantern filled the room. Maggie looked around. It was stark. One room, a stone hearth, a table with 2 chairs, a set of shelves holding a few tins, and in the corner, a bed. It was a narrow bed, the frame made of pine poles, covered with a heavy buffalo robe and a patchwork quilt. It dominated the room. Maggie couldn't take her eyes off it. The reality of what she had done crashed down on her. She was alone, miles from nowhere, with a man she barely knew. The storm outside rattled the shutters, a wild, lonely sound that made the cabin feel like a tiny boat on a dark ocean. Eli was busy at the hearth. He stacked kindling and struck another match. Fire bloomed, yellow and hungry, chasing back the shadows and the chill. He stood up and turned to her. He had taken off his wet coat and hat. His hair was plastered to his forehead. He looked at her, standing by the door in her damp gray dress, and she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. There's dry kindling in the box there, he said, pointing, flour and coffee in the tins. The water bucket is empty, but I'll fetch more in the morning. He was talking about chores. He was filling the silence with practicalities because the silence was too dangerous. There are extra blankets in the chest, he added. If you get cold. Maggie nodded. Thank you. She stepped closer to the fire, holding her hands out to the warmth. The steam began to rise from her damp clothes. Eli moved to the other side of the room. He seemed too big for the space. He paced a little, checking the shutter latch, moving a chair an inch. The tension in the room was a physical weight, heavier than the air pressure of the storm. They couldn't ignore the bed forever. Maggie turned to face him. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought he must hear it. She remembered the barn, the smell of whiskey, the weight, the panic. Eli stopped pacing. He looked at her, and his expression softened. He saw the fear. Maggie, he said. He took a step toward her, then stopped, keeping the width of the table between them. I meant what I said, he told her, his voice low and raw. Nothing is going to happen that you don't want. Maggie gripped the back of the chair. I know. You said, I know you're scared. Eli said, I can see it. You look like a trapped bird. He ran a hand through his damp hair, looking down at the floor. I'm scared too. Maggie, she blinked, startled. You? What are you afraid of? He looked up, and his eyes were open wounds. I'm afraid of failing you. I'm afraid that I don't know how to be what you need. I'm afraid I'll touch you and you'll shrink away like Sarah did. And I'll know that the town is right, that I'm not enough. The vulnerability in his voice cracked something open in Maggie's chest. This man, who had faced down a lynch mob of gossip, who had worked until his hands were scarred, who had offered her a home when no one else would, was terrified of disappointing her. He wasn't Silas. He wasn't a taker. He was a giver who was afraid his gift wasn't worth anything. The shame she had carried for 3 years, the dirty feeling of being ruined, suddenly felt heavy and useless. She didn't want to carry it anymore. She didn't want him to carry his shame either. Eli, she said, her voice trembling. She took a breath. It wasn't that I led him on. She whispered. Eli went still. In the barn, she said, Silas, I went there to deliver a blanket. He blocked the door. He said I owed him. He put his hands on me. She looked at Eli, forcing herself to say it. I fought him. I scratched his face. I screamed. But he was strong. He touched me. Eli, he put his mouth on me. I thought it was over, but I kicked him. I got free. She began to cry. Silent, hot tears. But the town, they said I went there for it. They said I was willing, and part of me has always felt like maybe they were right. Maybe I was dirty. Maybe that's why he thought he could. Eli moved. He didn't walk. He crossed the room in 2 long strides. He didn't grab her. He stopped inches from her, his fists clenched at his sides, his whole body radiating a heat that was pure, white-hot anger. But the anger wasn't at her. Look at me, he commanded. His voice was rough, like gravel. Maggie looked up. You are not dirty, Eli said fiercely. You are not ruined. What he did, that was his sin. Maggie, not yours. You fought. You survived. That makes you brave. It don't make you less. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face. You are worth 10 of him, he whispered. You are worth everything. Maggie leaned into his hand, her cheek pressing against his rough palm. The contact sent a shock through her, not of fear, but of something else, something warm and aching. Eli, she breathed. She turned her face, pressing her lips to the center of his palm. Eli inhaled sharply. His hand trembled against her face. Maggie looked at him. She saw the desire in his eyes now, burning behind the fear. It wasn't the greedy, devouring hunger of Silas. It was a worshipful, desperate thing. He wanted her, but he wanted her to be whole more than he wanted to have her. I'm not Sarah, she whispered, and I'm not afraid of you. She stepped closer, closing the gap between them. She reached up and touched his chest, feeling the heavy thud of his heart beneath the wet shirt. Eli's hands came up to hold her arms, his grip gentle, tentative. Maggie, kiss me, she said. He lowered his head slowly, giving her time to run, time to scream, but she didn't run. She lifted her chin. His lips touched hers. They were chapped and dry, and the kiss was clumsy at first, hesitant, a question asked in the dark. Is this all right? Am I doing this right? Maggie made a small sound in her throat and pressed closer. She opened her mouth slightly, inviting him in. The kiss deepened. Eli groaned, a low sound of relief and need, and his arms went around her, pulling her against the hard length of his body. The heat flared between them. Sudden and overwhelming, Maggie felt a rush of desire that shocked her. She had thought she was dead inside, frozen by trauma and shame. But she wasn't dead. She was alive, and she was burning. Eli pulled back, breathing hard, his forehead resting against hers. "Are you sure?" he rasped. "Yes," she said. He lifted her then, carrying her to the narrow bed in the corner. He laid her down as if she were made of glass. The storm howled outside, beating against the walls. But inside, the world narrowed down to the firelight and the touch of skin on skin. They undressed slowly, with fumbling fingers and whispered reassurances, when Eli finally lay beside her, skin to skin. Maggie felt a moment of old panic, but Eli stopped. He lay still, his hand stroking her hair, waiting. He let her set the pace. He let her come to him. And when they finally joined, it wasn't a conquest. It was a conversation. It was Eli proving with every slow, deliberate movement that he listened to her body. He responded to every hitch in her breath, pausing when she tensed, moving only when she melted. The rumor was a lie. The man who held her was not incapable. He was powerful, but his power was leashed by a profound tenderness. He worshipped her body with a focus that left no room for shame. Maggie felt the tears come again, but they were different now. She wrapped her legs around him, pulling him closer, needing him to be as close as two people could be. She wanted to erase the memory of the barn. She wanted to erase the memory of his empty wedding night. Together, they broke the silence of the cabin with the sounds of their own names, whispered like prayers. Later, much later, the fire had burned down to embers. The storm had quieted to a steady, rhythmic rain. Maggie lay with her head on Eli's chest, his arm heavy and protective over her waist. The buffalo robe was warm over them. Her body felt tired, sore, and wonderfully, completely at peace. She listened to Eli's breathing, slow and deep. She shifted slightly, and his arm tightened reflexively. "You okay?" he mumbled into her hair. "I'm better than okay," she whispered. Eli stared up at the dark rafters. He could feel the warmth of her along his side. He could feel the ghost of the pleasure they had shared. But more than that, he felt the absence of the weight he had carried for 5 years. He wasn't the man the town said he was. He was Eli Kane. He was a husband, and he was enough. "Sleep, Maggie," he said softly. "We have a lot of work to do tomorrow." She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, she slept without dreaming of the barn. She dreamed of the open prairie, and a house with a strong fence, and a man who stood at the gate, keeping the wolves at bay. The winter thawed into a spring that was as brief as a held breath, and then the summer settled over the Kane homestead like a heavy wool blanket. The life Maggie and Eli built together was measured not in hours, but in the height of the sun and the ache in their muscles. It was a rhythm of survival, a daily liturgy of chores that bound them to the land and to each other. The cabin, once a place of terrifying silence, became a vessel for the sounds of their living. Maggie learned the creak of the floorboards where Eli stepped first thing in the morning. She learned the sound of his boots, heavy and deliberate, and found that instead of the old dread that used to curdle her stomach when a man approached, a quiet warmth bloomed in her chest. It was the sound of safety. They worked from the moment the sky turned the color of bruised iron until the stars were sharp pinpricks above the prairie. Maggie hauled water from the creek, the bucket handle biting into her palms, her arms growing lean and hard. She learned to bake bread in the Dutch oven over the hearth, fighting the erratic drafts that threatened to collapse the dough. She learned to mend fence, holding the wire taut while Eli drove the staples home with a hammer that looked like a toy in his massive hand. The land was a hard master. The sun beat down with a hammer's weight, bleaching the color from the grass and turning the red dirt to a fine powder that coated their skin and gritted between their teeth. But there was beauty in the brutality. There were mornings when they sat on the cabin steps, tin cups of coffee steaming in the chill dawn air, watching the light bleed gold across the mountains. They did not speak much in those moments. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer an empty space, but a bridge. One morning, a stubborn billy goat they kept for milk for the weaning calves decided he would not be moved from the garden patch. Maggie pushed. She pulled. She scolded. But the beast stood rooted, chewing on a dried cornstalk with insolent slowness. Eli came around the corner of the barn, stopped, and watched. Maggie, hair escaping her bonnet, face flushed, planted her boots and heaved against the goat's flank. The goat simply leaned back against her, nearly knocking her into the dirt. Maggie let out a sound of frustration that was half growl, half laugh. She looked up and caught Eli watching her, a rare, crooked grin lifting the corner of his mouth beneath his mustache. "He thinks he is the landlord," Eli drawled, leaning on a pitchfork. "He is a tyrant," Maggie retorted, wiping sweat from her forehead. "And he smells worse than the bunkhouse on a Saturday night." Eli chuckled, a low rumble that Maggie felt in the soles of her feet. He walked over, grabbed the goat by the horns with one hand and the flank with the other, and lifted the animal bodily off the ground. The goat bleated in surprise as Eli deposited him on the other side of the fence. "Strength has its uses," Maggie said, dusting off her apron. Eli looked at her, his eyes dark and steady. "So does stubbornness. I reckon you have enough for the both of us." Maggie Kane. It was the first time he had teased her so openly. The warmth of it stayed with her all day. Their intimacy grew like the roots of the scrub oak, slow, deep, and hidden from the sky. It was not just in the bed, though the nights were a revelation that Maggie still approached with a sense of wonder. It was in the small touches that threaded through the day. It was Eli's hand resting on the small of her back as he passed her in the kitchen, a touch that claimed her without restraining her. It was the way she would reach up to brush the dust from his collar, her fingers lingering on the nape of his neck where the hair curled slightly. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of branding the few calves they had, they heated water in the copper boiler for a bath. The tin tub was set before the fire. Eli insisted she go first. When she was finished, wrapped in a rough towel, she added more hot water for him. He sank into the tub, his long legs bent, groaning as the heat seeped into his battered muscles. Maggie took the cake of soap and a rag. She knelt behind him. "Lean forward," she said softly. Eli obeyed. She washed his back, the cloth moving in slow circles over the ridges of muscle and the scars that mapped his history. She traced the line of the bullet wound on his shoulder, the old lash mark from a childhood she knew little about. He did not flinch. He sat heavy and still, trusting her with his blind side. "That feels good," he murmured, his voice rough with exhaustion. "You work too hard." "Eli, a man works for what he wants to keep," he answered. Maggie stopped her hand, resting it flat against his wet skin. She could feel the steady beat of his heart, in the flickering firelight, with the wind prowling outside like a hungry wolf. She felt a fierce, terrifying possessiveness. This was her life. This was her man. But the world outside the fence line did not vanish just because they had found peace within it. They rode into Dry Creek a week later for supplies: flour, coffee, and nails. The town was busy, wagons clattering and the boardwalks thick with people. As Eli turned the wagon toward the general store, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first. A conversation on the porch of the hotel died away. A woman sweeping her stoop paused, leaning on her broom to watch them pass. Maggie sat straight on the wagon seat, her hands folded in her lap. She felt the eyes on her skin like stinging insects. She saw Mrs. Gable whisper something to the banker's wife behind a gloved hand. The banker's wife looked at Maggie's simple calico dress and the plain gold band on her finger, then sniffed with an air of disdainful pity. Eli set the brake and hopped down to help Maggie. as her boots touched the ground. Two men walking out of the saloon stopped. One was Bates, the drift rider who had mocked Eli before. "Well, look at that," Bates said, loud enough to be heard over the street noise. "The happy couple. I guess some women will settle for a warm house, even if the bed is cold," his companion snickered. "Maybe she likes the quiet. Bates, maybe she gets enough sleep that way." The heat rushed into Maggie's face, hot and shameful. She saw Eli stiffen. His back was to the men, but his shoulders rose, the muscles beneath his shirt bunching like coiled wire. His hand, resting on the wagon wheel, gripped the wood until his knuckles turned white. "Eli," Maggie whispered, touching his arm. "Don't." Eli turned slowly. He looked at Bates. There was violence in his eyes, a raw, bloody desire to cross the 10 feet between them and drive the man's teeth down his throat. He wanted to break the jaw that spoke the lies. He wanted to prove his manhood in the only language these men understood: force. But he saw the sheriff watching from the jailhouse porch. He saw the gleam of anticipation in Bates's eyes. They wanted him to snap. They wanted the eunuch to rage so they could call him a beast as well as a failure. Eli clamped his jaw so hard a tendon jumped in his neck. He turned his back on them. "Come on, Maggie," he said, his voice a low grind of gravel. He took her elbow and steered her into the store. As the door closed, cutting off the laughter outside, Maggie looked up at him. His face was pale beneath the tan, his eyes fixed on nothing. The resentment radiated off him, a bitter heat. He had walked away, but the victory felt like cowardice to him. Maggie squeezed his arm, but he did not squeeze back. The shadow of Silas Harper fell over them 2 days later. He rode up to the cabin in the late afternoon, accompanied by his foreman. He did not dismount. He sat his fine bay horse, looking at the repaired fence, the stacked wood, the small but healthy garden. He looked like a king surveying a rebellious province. Eli walked out from the barn, wiping grease from his hands on a rag. Maggie stood in the doorway of the cabin, her hand on the latch, her heart thumping a warning rhythm. "Afternoon." "Silas," Eli said. He did not offer water. He did not offer a welcome. "Eli." Silas nodded, smiling that smile that never reached his eyes. "Place is looking up. You've done good work. I work for myself now, mostly," Eli said. Silas's horse danced, and he checked it with a sharp jerk of the reins. "That is what I wanted to discuss. I'm hearing talk that the creek is running low upstream. The Circle Bar folks are damming more than their share." Eli said nothing. "I'm putting together a group to go. Discuss it with them." Silas said, "To remind them how water rights work in this territory. I expect my men to ride with me. I ain't your man." "Silas," Eli said quietly, "I work your cattle for pay. I don't ride for your wars." Silas leaned forward over the pommel of his saddle. The smile vanished. "It is a dry year. Eli, a man needs friends. A man who stands alone often finds that bad luck finds him." "Is that a threat?" Eli asked. "It is advice. Loyalty is a currency. Eli, you are spending yours on a patch of dirt and a woman who, well, let us just say you have made your choices." Silas looked past Eli to where Maggie stood. His gaze lingered on her, cold and assessing, stripping away the illusion of her safety. "Think on it," Silas said. He wheeled his horse and galloped away, his foreman trailing in the dust. The drought came in earnest in July. The sky turned a relentless, pale blue that offered no mercy. Clouds would gather in the afternoon, promising relief, only to break apart and vanish without dropping a single bead of rain. The creek, usually a lively chatter of water, slowed to a sluggish crawl, then to a series of muddy pools. The grass turned brittle and yellow. The cattle grew thin, their ribs showing through their hides like the staves of a barrel. In town, tempers frayed like old rope. Arguments over water rights turned into fistfights. Silas Harper used his money to bribe the water commissioner, ensuring the Harper channels stayed wet while the smaller ranchers watched their crops wither. At the cabin, the world shrank. Eli and Maggie rationed everything. They bathed once a week, sharing the same scant inches of water. Meals became simple: beans, cornbread, and the occasional rabbit Eli managed to shoot. The heat was inescapable. It pressed down on the roof, turning the cabin into an oven. The strain began to seep into the foundation of their marriage. Eli would come in late, exhausted and covered in dust, his face lined with worry. He would look at the dwindling flour sack, at Maggie's hands red from scrubbing with little soap, and the shame would eat at him. He compared himself to Silas. Silas had windmills. Silas had grain silos full of feed. Silas could give a woman silk and cool rooms. Eli had nothing but a drying creek and a bad reputation. One night, after a dinner of watery stew, Eli sat at the table, staring at his hands. Maggie came up behind him and put her arms around his neck. "Come to bed," she whispered. "You're tired." Eli stiffened. He pulled her arms away gently but firmly. "It's too hot, Maggie," he muttered. "I'm going to sleep in the loft tonight. Get some air moving." Maggie stood frozen, her hands empty in the air. It wasn't just the heat. She knew it. He had been distant for a week. He hadn't touched her. He turned away when she undressed. The old fear, the one she thought she had buried, clawed its way out of the grave. "Is it me?" she thought. "Did I do something wrong? Or is it true? Was his desire just a momentary thing, and now he is what they said he was?" Eli climbed the ladder to the loft without looking back. Maggie lay alone in the narrow bed, the silence of the room screaming at her, the distance between them feeling wider than the prairie outside. Then came the fire. It happened on a Tuesday night, a hot, windless evening. A glow appeared on the horizon, toward the Harper Ranch. It wasn't the wild, sweeping line of a prairie fire. It was concentrated, a single bright beacon of destruction. The next day, the news arrived with the sheriff. Sheriff Miller rode into their yard with 3 deputies. He didn't look bored this time. He looked purposeful. "Eli Kane," the sheriff called out. "Step out here." Eli walked out of the barn. Maggie followed, wiping flour from her hands, her heart in her throat. "What's the trouble?" "Sheriff?" Eli asked. "Silas Harper's north feed barn burned last night. The sheriff said, lost 50 tons of hay. That's a hard loss." Eli said, his face impassive. "It is, especially when it looks like arson. The door was barred from the outside." "And you come to me?" Eli asked. "Silas says you were seen riding near the North Ridge last night, late, after midnight." Eli hesitated. He had been riding. He had ridden out after the argument, the silent argument of his own withdrawal, to cool his head, to try and outrun his own feelings of inadequacy. He had ridden near the ridge. I was riding. Eli admitted. "I couldn't sleep." "Riding near a barn with a lucifer in your pocket?" the sheriff sneered. "Silas says you've been holding a grudge since he asked for your help with the water. Says maybe you wanted to show him you aren't a man to be trifled with." "I didn't burn his barn," Eli said steadily. "Then where were you?" "Exactly. I told you. I was riding. Alone." The sheriff laughed. "Alone? That fits. A man like you spends a lot of time alone, doesn't he? Even when he's married." The deputies chuckled. "Maybe that's it," the sheriff went on, his voice dropping to a nasty, intimate tone. "Maybe you're frustrated, Kane. Maybe since you can't perform at home, you need to light a fire somewhere else to feel like a man." "Is that it? You need to destroy something because you can't create anything?" The insult hit Eli like a physical blow. He flinched, his eyes going wide and dark. The wound was ripped open, raw and bleeding in the sunlight. He took a step forward, his fists clenching. "You watch your mouth," Eli growled. "Or what? You'll hit me. Assault on a lawman." "Stop it." The voice was Maggie's. She stepped off the porch, walking straight into the circle of men. She was shaking, her face pale, but her head was high. He was not near the barn, she said clearly. The sheriff looked down at her. "Is that so, Mrs. Kane? He just admitted he was riding. He was riding earlier." Maggie lied. Her voice was steady, gaining strength. "But at midnight?" "At midnight, he was home." "And how do you know that?" "Because he was in bed with me," she said. The silence that fell over the yard was total. In 1875, a respectable woman did not speak of the bed. She did not admit to being with her husband in the dark. It was a taboo so deep it was almost a law. Maggie looked the sheriff in the eye. "He was with me," she repeated, her cheeks burning with a fire that had nothing to do with the heat. "We were awake. I know exactly where he was. Sheriff, and he was nowhere near Silas Harper's barn." The sheriff looked from Maggie to Eli. He saw the shock on Eli's face, but he also saw the defiance in Maggie's. He knew he couldn't prove otherwise. Not without calling a woman a liar to her face in front of witnesses about a matter of the bedroom. He spat into the dust. "You're covering for him, Maggie, and it's a pitiful story. Everyone knows what happens, or doesn't happen in that house." He gathered his reins. "We'll be watching you, Cain. Silas won't forget this." The posse turned and rode out, leaving a cloud of dust that hung in the still air. Eli didn't move until they were gone. Then he turned to Maggie. He looked stricken. "Why did you say that?" he asked hoarsely. "Because it needed to be said," she answered, wrapping her arms around herself. They went to town that afternoon to speak to the lawyer, to ensure no charges were filed. It was a mistake. The story of Maggie's alibi had beaten them there. As they walked down the boardwalk, the humiliation was absolute. It wasn't just whispers now. It was open staring. "She lied for him," a man said as they passed the livery. "Said he was bedding her. Can you imagine? Having to lie about that just to keep your husband from hanging? Poor girl." A woman clucked. "She's desperate to make him look like a man. It's sad, really." Maggie kept walking, her eyes fixed ahead, but she felt stripped naked. They didn't believe her. They thought she was a pathetic wife covering for a eunuch. And Eli. Eli walked beside her, rigid as a corpse, hearing every word. They left town an hour later, the silence in the wagon thick enough to suffocate them. Night fell on the cabin, hot and oppressive. The wind had picked up, scratching dry branches against the logs. Inside, Eli paced. He had been pacing for an hour. Maggie sat at the table, mending a shirt, her needle flashing in the lamplight. "Stop it," she said finally. "You're wearing a hole in the floor." Eli stopped. He turned to her, and his face was twisted with a mixture of rage and grief she had never seen. "You shouldn't have said it," he shouted. "I saved you," Maggie shouted back, slamming her hand on the table. "They were going to arrest you. Eli, by humiliating yourself, by telling the whole town a lie that makes you look like a fool. It wasn't a lie, not in spirit. It was a lie," Eli roared. "I wasn't with you. I was out on the prairie because I couldn't stand to be in this house." The words hung in the air, vibrating. Maggie stood up slowly, the shirt sliding to the floor. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why couldn't you stand to be here? Because look at this." Eli gestured wildly around the room. "Look at what I've given you. A debt I can't pay, a drought I can't stop, a reputation that follows you like a stink. Silas was right. I'm dragging you down. You deserve a man who can give you water and safety, not this." He turned away, leaning his hands on the mantelpiece, his head hanging low. "And today, hearing them laugh at you, hearing them say you have to lie to make me a man." He made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "Maybe they're right. Maggie, maybe I'm not enough. Maybe I never will be." Maggie looked at his broad back. She saw the tension, the self-loathing that Silas and the town had planted in him, the weeds choking out his spirit. She walked over to him. She grabbed his shoulder and spun him around. He tried to resist, but she was fierce. "Don't you dare," she hissed. "Don't you dare do their work for them." She grabbed his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "You think I care about their money? You think I care about Silas Harper's windmills? Silas wanted to buy me. Eli, he wanted to make me a whore in my own house to pay a debt." Eli flinched, pain flashing in his eyes. "You," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "You offered me a name. You offered me protection. And in this bed, in this house, you gave me back myself." She pressed her forehead against his. "Do you believe them? she asked. "Do you believe the sheriff? Or do you believe me? Do you believe what we have?" Eli closed his eyes. He breathed in the scent of her, soap and sage and woman. He felt the calloused strength of her hands on his face. "I believe you," he whispered. "Then prove it." She said. She kissed him. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a demand. It was a claiming. She kissed him with all the frustration and fear and anger of the last month. Eli broke. The dam of his restraint shattered. He wrapped his arms around her, crushing her to him, burying his face in her neck. He lifted her, not toward the loft, but toward their bed, the bed they shared. They fell onto it together, a tangle of limbs and frantic hands. Clothes were stripped away with impatient urgency. There was no shyness tonight, no hesitation. Eli moved over her, his eyes locking with hers. He needed to be inside her, not just for pleasure, but to anchor himself to the earth. He needed to know that this, at least, was real. Maggie met him, arching into his touch, her nails digging into his shoulders. She wanted him to feel her desire, to know that it wasn't a lie, wasn't a cover-up. It was the truest thing in her life. "Eli," she gasped, pulling him down. He entered her, and the world outside ceased to exist. The drought, the sheriff, Silas, they all burned away. There was only the friction of skin, the heat of their breath, the desperate, rhythmic affirmation of their life together. It was fierce. It was raw. It was a reclaiming of territory that had been invaded. Every thrust was a refutation of the rumor. Every cry was a testament to the truth. Eli buried his face in her shoulder, groaning her name, giving her everything he had, his strength, his fear, his love. And Maggie took it all, holding him, wrapping herself around him, being the harbor for his storm. When it was over, they lay tangled together, slick with sweat, their chests heaving. The cabin was silent except for the wind scratching at the walls. Eli rolled onto his side, pulling the blanket up over them. He pulled Maggie against him, his arm locking her close, his leg thrown over hers. He held her as if the floor might drop away if he let go. Maggie rested her hand on his chest, feeling his heart slow to a steady, strong rhythm. She felt an exhaustion that went down to her bones, but it was a good exhaustion. It was the feeling of a battle fought and won. Outside, the drought still held the land in a chokehold. Silas Harper was still plotting. The town still whispered. But inside the cabin, in the dark, Eli kissed the top of her head. "I'm here," he whispered into the darkness. "I ain't going nowhere. I know," Maggie answered. They slept, holding on to each other, their love a small, stubborn light in the vast, uncaring dark of the West. They had survived the fire. Now they just had to survive the rest. August arrived not with a whimper, but with a hammer blow. The drought, which had been a looming specter in July, materialized into a living, breathing tyrant that choked the life out of the territory. The sky turned a bleached, blinding white, devoid of clouds. A vast lid of iron clamped down over the world to hold in the heat. Dry Creek ceased to be a name and became a prophecy fulfilled. The stream bed was a network of cracked mud, looking like the skin of some great dead reptile. The cottonwoods that lined the banks turned brittle and gray, their leaves rattling like dry bones in the hot wind that never ceased. Surviving the land became a daily war. Every morning, Eli rose before the sun to haul water from the deep well, the only source that had not yet failed. The bucket rope frayed in his hands, growing thinner with every hoist, much like the cattle that stood in the sparse shade of the barn. Their ribs showed through their dusty hides like the staves of a barrel, and their lowing was a weak, pitiful sound that grated on the nerves. Maggie fought her own battles inside the cabin. The dust was an enemy that could not be defeated, only held at bay. It seeped through the chinking in the logs, coated the dishes in the cupboard, and settled in the creases of the bedsheets. She swept until her palms were blistered. But an hour later, a fresh layer of red grit covered the floor. The air was thick with it, a haze that turned the sun into a blood-orange disk by late afternoon. This was not just weather. It felt personal. It felt as though the land itself had decided to shrug them off. Silas Harper moved through this devastation like a shark in shallow water, while small ranchers watched their herds die or sold them off for pennies on the dollar. Silas bought. He bought land. He bought water rights, and he bought men. His windmills pumped deep water from the aquifer, keeping his own stock watered while his neighbors watched their livelihoods turn to dust. He came to the cane cabin 3 days after the heat broke 100 degrees. He did not come alone. 2 of his riders, hard-eyed men with guns tied low on their thighs, waited by the gate while Silas rode up to where Eli was mending a harness on the porch. Eli did not stand up. He kept his eyes on the leather in his hands, driving the awl through the tough strap. "Afternoon, Eli," Silas said, his voice smooth and untouched by the dust that coated everyone else. "Silas, you are holding out better than most," Silas observed, glancing at the small stack of hay in the shed. "Though that well of yours won't last forever. The water table is dropping." "It will last long enough," Eli said. Silas dismounted, dusting off his pristine coat. He walked to the porch rail, leaning against it with a casual ownership that made the hair on Eli's neck stand up. "I have a proposition for you. Eli, the Miller place, up the canyon. Old man Miller is sitting on a spring that feeds the north pasture. He refuses to sell. He says his grandfather is buried there and he won't leave the bones." "Miller is a good man," Eli said, finally looking up. "He is a stubborn man," Silas corrected, "and stubbornness is expensive in a drought. I need that water. Eli, my herd is growing. I plan to ride up there tomorrow and explain the reality of the situation to him. I want you with me." Eli set the harness down slowly. "You want me to help you scare an old man off his land? I want you to help me secure the future of this valley," Silas said. "You have a reputation. Eli, people know you are complicated. If you ride with me, Miller will see that even the independent men have chosen a side. He will fold without violence. And if he doesn't?" Silas smiled, a thin stretching of lips. "Then we do what is necessary." Eli stood up. He towered over Silas, his shadow falling across the wealthy rancher. "Get off my porch, Silas." Silas did not flinch, though his eyes narrowed. "You are making a mistake. I don't steal water, and I don't bully old men," Eli said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I don't ride for you, not for wages, and not for fear." Silas straightened his coat. He looked at Eli with a cold, terrifying calculation. "You think you are safe because you have a deed and a few cows," he said softly. "But out here, Eli, a man is only as safe as his friends make him. And you have no friends." He walked back to his horse, mounted, and rode away without looking back. The retaliation did not take long. 2 nights later, the moon was hidden behind a thick veil of dust. The wind howled around the cabin, masking the sound of riders moving through the dark. The next morning, the sheriff arrived. It was not a social call. Sheriff Miller rode at the head of a posse of 6 men. They did not stop at the gate. They rode straight into the yard, their horses kicking up clouds of red dust that hung in the stagnant air. Eli was in the barn, forking the last of the hay to the horses. Maggie was in the garden, trying to coax life out of a withered tomato plant. When she saw the men, her stomach dropped like a stone. She saw the shotguns resting across saddle horns. She saw the grim anticipation on their faces. "Eli!" she screamed, dropping her hoe and running toward the barn. Eli emerged, wiping his hands on his trousers. He saw the sheriff and stopped, his body going rigid. He knew this look. He had seen it in the war, and he had seen it in towns where the law was just a suggestion. "Sheriff," Eli said, keeping his voice steady. "Search the barn," the sheriff ordered, ignoring him. 2 men dismounted and pushed past Eli. "Now hold on," Eli shouted, stepping forward. "You have no right." One of the riders leveled a Winchester at Eli's chest. "Stay put. Kane." Maggie reached Eli's side, grabbing his arm. "What is happening? What do you want?" "We had a report of rustling last night," the sheriff said, his eyes hard. "Silas Harper lost 20 head of prime steers. The tracks led this way." "That's a lie," Eli spat. "I was here all night." "We'll see," the sheriff said. A shout came from the gully behind the barn. where the land dipped down into a dry wash. "Sheriff, over here!" The sheriff rode over, followed by the others. Eli and Maggie ran after them. In the bottom of the wash, half hidden under a pile of tumbleweeds and brush, lay 4 fresh cow hides. The brand on the flank was clear, even in the dust, the Bar H of the Harper Ranch. Eli stared at them, the blood draining from his face. He looked at the sheriff. "I didn't put those there," he said. "I haven't butchered a cow in 6 months." The sheriff looked down from his horse. "Evidence says otherwise. Kane, tracks lead right from Harper's north pasture to your gate. And here are the hides. It's a frame-up," Maggie cried, stepping in front of Eli. "Silas did this. He threatened Eli 2 days ago because Eli wouldn't help him steal water." The sheriff shook his head. "Mrs. Kane, you have a habit of telling tall tales to save your husband. First the barn fire, now this. But hides don't lie." He turned to the men. "Bring the wagon around. We are taking him in." But the mood of the men had shifted. They weren't looking at the sheriff. They were looking at the hides, and then at Eli. The heat, the drought, the frustration of watching their own cattle die while Silas prospered, it all boiled up. But it was misdirected. They needed someone to blame. And Eli was the perfect vessel. He was the outsider, the gelding, the freak, and now, the thief. "Why wait for a judge?" one of the men muttered. "He's a rustler. We caught him red-handed. Get a rope," another voice called out. The air in the yard changed instantly. It went from a legal confrontation to a lynching. The civility stripped away like cheap varnish. Eli saw it happen. He saw the bloodlust flare in their eyes. He grabbed Maggie's shoulder and shoved her toward the cabin. "Get inside! Maggie, bar the door! No!" she screamed, digging her heels in. "I'm not leaving you! Get inside!" Eli roared, panic cracking his voice for the first time. He didn't wait for her to obey. He turned to face the mob. "I didn't steal them!" he shouted. "Look at the hides! The blood is fresh!" "I've been working in the barn all morning. Where is the blood on me? Where is the meat?" It didn't matter. Logic had no place here. A man named Bates, the same drift rider who had mocked Eli in town, slid off his horse. He held a coil of hemp rope in his hand. "You stole from honest men?" "Kane." Bates sneered. "You think because you can't be a man in bed, you have to be a thief to make up for it?" He walked toward Eli, the loop of the rope swinging gently. Eli backed up, his hands raised, palms out. "Sheriff, do your job. Stop this." The sheriff sat on his horse, looking uncomfortable but making no move to draw his gun. Silas Harper's influence was heavy on his shoulders. Silas wasn't there, but his shadow was. "I can't stop the will of the people." "Kane," the sheriff muttered, looking away. Bates lunged. Eli sidestepped, but another man grabbed him from behind. Eli threw an elbow, connecting with a crunch of bone, but a third man tackled him around the waist. They went down in the dust, a tangle of limbs and shouting. Maggie screamed, a raw, tearing sound. She ran toward the pile of men, grabbing at coats, scratching at faces. "Leave him alone! Get off him!" Bates grabbed Maggie by the arm and flung her aside with brutal force. She hit the dirt hard, the breath knocked out of her. "Stay out of it, woman," Bates yelled. "You'll have to find another man to keep you warm tonight, maybe a real one this time." The insult cut through the noise. Eli, pinned beneath 2 men, heard it. He heard Maggie hit the ground. He heard the slur against her, the threat in the man's voice. Something inside Eli broke. The restraint he had practiced for 5 years, the careful control he had maintained to prove he wasn't a monster, shattered. With a roar that sounded more animal than human, Eli surged upward. He threw the men off him as if they were children. He lunged at Bates. His fist connected with Bates's jaw with a sound like a pistol shot. Bates's head snapped back, and he dropped like a sack of feed. But the violence was the spark the mob had been waiting for. "He's fighting back!" someone yelled. "Shoot him!" Guns were drawn. The chaotic swirl of the fight moved toward the hay shed. A shot rang out, wild and deafening. It missed Eli, but it struck the lantern hanging on the side of the wagon that had been brought for the rope. The lantern shattered. Kerosene splashed across the dry wood of the wagon and the pile of loose hay near the shed door. In the drought-ravaged air, the hay did not just burn, it exploded. Whoosh! A wall of orange flame roared up the side of the shed. The horses panicked, rearing and screaming. The mob scattered, shouting curses. Fire! The flames leaped with terrifying speed. Jumping from the shed to the stack of winter firewood Eli had spent months cutting. The heat was instantaneous and blistering. In the confusion, Eli scrambled to his feet. He was bleeding from a cut over his eye, his shirt torn. He looked around for Maggie. She was on her knees, coughing in the sudden smoke. She looked up and saw him. She saw the men regrouping, their faces lit by the firelight, their guns now leveled with intent. "Run!" she screamed. "Eli, run!" Eli hesitated. Every instinct in him screamed to stand his ground, to protect his home, to protect her. "They will kill you!" Maggie shrieked, scrambling toward him. "If you stay, they will hang you. Go!" Eli looked at the mob. The sheriff was shouting orders, but the men were blood-mad now. They blamed Eli for the fire, too. He looked at Maggie. Her face was streaked with dust and tears, her eyes wide with terror, not for herself, but for him. "I will come back," he rasped, his voice breaking. "I swear it. Maggie, go!" Eli turned. He sprinted toward the back of the burning shed. Using the smoke as cover, he scrambled up the side of the ravine, his boots slipping on the loose rock. "There he goes," a man shouted. 2 shots kicked up dirt near Eli's feet, but the smoke was too thick. He crested the ridge and dove into the scrub brush, vanishing into the darkening hills. Back in the yard, the mob turned their frustration on the woman left behind. "Burn the house too," a man yelled. "Rat's nest!" Maggie scrambled to her feet. She ran to the porch, not to hide, but to the wood box where Eli kept the old Colt Navy pistol wrapped in oilcloth. She ripped the cloth away and cocked the heavy hammer. She turned to face the men. Behind her, the shed was a towering inferno, casting long, dancing shadows across the yard. Maggie stood framed against the fire, her hair wild, the heavy gun shaking in her hands. "Get back!" she screamed. The men stopped. They looked at the woman, small and fierce, holding a gun that could blow a hole through a door. "Now, hold on, Mrs. Kane!" the sheriff shouted, raising a hand. "Put the gun down!" "Get off my land!" Maggie yelled, her voice cracking with fury. "You wanted a thief. You chased him off. Now get out before I kill the first man who takes a step closer." She swung the barrel toward Bates, who was groggily getting to his feet. "Try me," she hissed. The sheriff looked at the fire, which was threatening to spread to the prairie grass. He looked at the woman who looked ready to die before she let them take another inch. "Pull back," the sheriff ordered. "Let it go. The fire is punishment enough for tonight. But Sheriff, I said pull back. We'll get him later. He can't go far." The men, sullen and coughing from the smoke, mounted their panicked horses. They wheeled around and rode out, leaving the burning shed and the lone woman standing guard over the wreckage. Maggie did not lower the gun until the last hoofbeat had faded into the wind. Only then did her knees give way. She sank to the porch floor, the pistol clattering from her hand. She watched the fire consume the shed. She watched the winter firewood, months of labor, months of warmth, turn to ash and float away into the night sky. She was alone. The silence that followed the roar of the fire was heavier than the mountains. Eli ran until his lungs burned and his legs felt like lead. He ran through the dark, guided only by the layout of the land he had memorized. He scrambled down into deep ravines where the shadows were absolute, tearing his clothes on mesquite thorns, bruising his knees on rocks. He stopped miles away, in a narrow canyon where a trickle of water still seeped from the rocks. He collapsed against a boulder, gasping for air, his chest heaving. The guilt was a physical weight, heavier than the exhaustion. He had left her. He had run away and left his wife to face a mob. "Coward," a voice whispered in his head. "You ran, just like you ran from Texas." He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing the heels of his hands into his sockets. No. If he had stayed, he would be swinging from a cottonwood branch right now, and Maggie would be a widow, left to the mercy of Silas Harper. Alive. He was a threat. Alive. He had a chance. He spent the next week moving like a coyote. He slept in rocky overhangs during the day and moved at night. He ate prickly pear fruit and raw roots. The nights were growing colder, the first bite of autumn slipping into the wind. He circled back once, watching the cabin from a high ridge 2 miles away. He saw the blackened scar where the shed had been. He saw a thin plume of smoke from the chimney. She was there. She was alive, but he couldn't go back. Not yet. The sheriff had put a bounty on his head, $50 for the Dry Creek rustler. If he returned now, he would be arrested or shot on sight. He needed money to hire a lawyer. He needed time for the heat to die down. He needed to find out who had planted the hides. He made a decision in the cold, gray light of dawn. He would head north, toward the railhead in Wyoming. There were big drives coming up from Texas, always looking for hands. He would work under a false name. He would earn every dollar he could, and he would come back with enough gold to clear his name and buy his life back. Goodbye, Maggie, he whispered to the wind. Wait for me. He turned his back on the valley and began to walk. For Maggie. The weeks that followed were a blur of scorn and survival. The town of Dry Creek did not forgive her for her defiance. When she walked into the general store to buy flour with her dwindling coin, the silence was suffocating. I hear the sheriff is still looking. Mrs. Gable said loudly to the clerk. Though why anyone would want a rustler back is beyond me. Better off without him, another woman sniffed. Maybe she can find an annulment. After all, was it really a marriage? A thief and a... well, you know. Maggie placed her coins on the counter. The clerk took them with 2 fingers, as if they were contagious. My husband is not a thief, Maggie said clearly, her voice cutting through the whispers. And he is twice the man any of yours are. She took her flour and walked out, head high, though her hands shook uncontrollably once she was out of sight. Silas Harper did not shout. He did not send mobs. He waited until she was at her lowest. 3 weeks after Eli had gone, he found her chopping wood from a fallen cottonwood tree near the creek, trying to replenish what the fire had taken. It was back-breaking work. Maggie, Silas said, riding up on his bay. She didn't stop swinging the axe. I have nothing to say to you. Silas, you're making this hard on yourself, he said, watching her struggle with the heavy log. Winter is coming. You have no wood. You have no money. Your husband is a fugitive who ran away to save his own skin. He didn't run, Maggie said, breathlessly delivering a strike. He is coming back. Silas laughed softly. They always say that. But Eli Kane, he's a runner. Maggie, he ran from his first wife. He ran from you. He's probably halfway to Canada by now, spending stolen money on whiskey. Liar. I can stop the sheriff, Silas said. I can call off the hunt. I can make sure your brother gets a doctor. I can fill your woodshed tomorrow. Maggie stopped. She leaned on the axe handle, looking at him. She saw the trap in his eyes, the hunger that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with possession. And what do you want? She asked. You know what I want. I want you to be sensible. I want you to realize that you are alone and that I am the only one who can keep you alive. Maggie looked at the charred remains of the shed in the distance. She looked at the empty horizon where Eli had vanished. I would rather freeze, she said. Silas's face hardened. Then you probably will. He turned his horse. Don't say I didn't offer charity. Maggie, I don't want your charity. Silas, I want justice. And when Eli comes back, you will answer for the hides. Silas chuckled darkly. If he comes back, Maggie, he'll be coming back to a grave. Winter arrived in November with a violence that made the drought seem like a kindness. The wind shifted from the south to the north, bringing air that tasted of ice and pine needles. The first snow fell thick and heavy, burying the blackened scar of the fire under a white shroud. The cabin was drafty. Maggie stuffed rags into the cracks and hung quilts over the windows, but the cold found its way in. Survival became a math problem. 3 logs for the morning, 2 for the afternoon. Banked the fire at night. They ate cornmeal mush and preserved beans. Jamie's cough returned. rattling in his chest like dry peas in a pod. Maggie slept in her clothes, wrapped in the buffalo robe. She slept on the side of the bed where Eli used to lie. The bed felt enormous without him. It was a vast, cold desert. She would curl up, pressing her face into the ticking of the mattress, trying to find a lingering scent of him. Tobacco, horse, the musk of his skin. Sometimes, when the wind howled like a banshee and the loneliness was too much to bear, she would talk to him. "I am keeping the fire. Eli," she would whisper into the dark. "I am feeding the goats. I am not afraid." She remembered the weight of his arm over her waist. She remembered the rough calluses of his fingers tracing her spine. She remembered the way he had looked at her the night of the rainstorm, not as a broken thing, but as a treasure. "He is real," she told herself, clutching the pillow. "What we had was real. He did not run from me. He ran for me." Hundreds of miles to the north, on the high plains of Wyoming, a man who called himself Clay sat by a campfire. The wind was just as cold here. The snow was just as deep. The cattle drive had bedded down for the night. The other hands rolled in their blankets, snoring lumps under the frost. Eli sat awake, staring into the low embers of the fire. His hands were raw from the cold and the rope work. His beard had grown out, thick and dark, hiding the line of his jaw. He held a tin cup of bitter coffee, warming his fingers. But his mind was not on the cattle or the cold. He looked into the fire and saw her face. He saw Maggie standing on the porch with the gun, fierce and terrifying and beautiful. He felt the phantom sensation of her skin against his, the warmth that had thawed 5 years of ice in his soul. He reached out his hand toward the fire, as if he could touch her across the vast, empty distance. "I'm coming. Maggie," he whispered to the flames. "Hold on, just hold on, in the cabin in Dry Creek." Maggie reached her hand out from the buffalo robe toward the dying embers of her own hearth. The sparks drifted up the chimney, rising into the cold night air. 2 signals from 2 fires, lost in the immense silence of the American West, but burning just the same. The wind on the high plains of Wyoming did not blow. It screamed. It came down from the Bighorn Mountains with teeth of ice, tearing at the canvas coats of the drovers and stinging the eyes of the cattle until the beasts huddled together, lowing in misery. Eli Kane, known to the men of the Flying W outfit only as Clay, rode the flank of the herd. He sat his horse with the grim endurance of a man who had forgotten what comfort felt like. His beard had grown out thick and dark, hiding the line of his jaw and the hollows of his cheeks, but it could not hide the haunted look in his eyes. It had been 4 months since he had fled Dry Creek. 4 months of dawn rides that started before the sun cracked the horizon, of dust that coated his lungs until he coughed up red mud, of nights spent shivering under a thin blanket while the ground sucked the heat from his bones. He worked like a man possessed. When a steer broke from the herd, Eli was the first to turn it, his horse dancing through the sagebrush. When the wagons got stuck in a mud wallow, Eli was the one in the muck, shoulder to the wheel, straining until his vision blurred. He courted exhaustion like a lover, desperate for the oblivion of sleep to save him from his own mind. But sleep was a traitor. In the few hours of rest he was granted, the dreams came. He saw the fire roaring up the side of the shed. He saw the mob's faces twisted in hate. And worst of all, he saw Maggie. He saw her standing in the yard, screaming for him to run. He felt the phantom warmth of her skin against his in the cabin. The memory so sharp, it woke him with a gasp, his chest aching with a hollow, physical hunger. The drive reached a small, mud-caked town near the border. The trail boss, a hard man named Sutter, called a halt for supplies and whiskey. "Loose rain tonight, boys." Sutter grunted. "Don't burn the town down, and be in the saddle by sunup." The men descended on the local saloon like locusts, desperate for liquor and female company. Eli went with them, mostly to escape the silence of the camp, but he drank his whiskey alone at a corner table, his back to the wall. A woman approached him. She was painted and tired, wearing a dress of cheap red satin that had seen better years. She put a hand on his shoulder, her fingers trailing near his neck. "You look like you carry the weight of the world. Cowboy, she purred. I can help you set it down for a while. $2. Eli looked at her hand, then up at her face. He saw the weariness there, the mirror of his own. For a moment, the loneliness in him roared, demanding to be touched, demanding to be held by anyone. Anything. But then he remembered the smell of sage soap and the feel of a plain gold ring against his skin. I am married, Eli said. His voice was rough, unused to soft words. The woman laughed, a dry, brittle sound. Honey, on the trail. Every man is a bachelor. Your wife is a long way off. She won't know. Eli set his glass down. I would know. He stood up, towering over her, and the painted smile faltered on her face. He placed a silver dollar on the table. Buy yourself a drink, ma'am. He walked out into the cold night, leaving the warmth and the noise behind. He walked until the town was a speck of light in the darkness, looking up at the vast, indifferent stars. He was running to save his life, but every step he took away from Maggie felt like he was killing the only part of himself worth saving. 500 miles to the south, Maggie O'Rourke. She refused to be called the Widow Kane, though the town tried, was fighting a different kind of war. The sun had not yet risen over Dry Creek, but Maggie was already awake. She was on her knees in the Tin Star Saloon, a bucket of soapy water beside her, scrubbing the floorboards where men had spit and spilled whiskey the night before. The owner, a fat man named Higgins, let her clean in the early hours in exchange for $2 a week. It was humiliating work. The smell of stale beer and old tobacco smoke clung to her hair and clothes. But $2 bought cornmeal. $2 bought syrup for Jamie's cough. Maggie scrubbed harder, the brush biting into the wood. Her hands were raw, the knuckles cracked and bleeding from the lye soap and the cold. She finished the floor and moved to the spittoons, emptying them into the alley with a grimace. As she worked, she held on to her anger. It was the fuel that kept her moving. She was angry at Silas Harper. She was angry at the sheriff. She was angry at the town that watched her struggle and offered nothing but judgment. And she was angry at Eli. Not for leaving, she had told him to run, but for the silence. Is he dead? She wondered as she wiped down the bar. Is he lying in a ditch somewhere? Or did he just keep riding? Later that morning, she went to the boarding house to help in the kitchen. As she peeled potatoes, she listened. She had become a ghost in the town, invisible to the men who talked freely around her. 2 drovers were eating breakfast, shoveling eggs into their mouths. Saw a fight up in Laramie 2 weeks back, one said, chewing with his mouth open. Big fella. Went by the name of Clay. Some drunk pulled a knife on him. This Clay fella didn't even draw, just broke the man's wrist like it was a twig. Big man? The other asked. Huge. Dark hair. Scar on his arm. Looked like a bullet crease. Quiet as a stone. Maggie's knife slipped, nicking her thumb. She stared at the potato, her heart hammering against her ribs. Scar on his arm. Quiet as a stone. He was alive. He was moving. He was fighting. The fragile hope flared in her chest. Hot and bright. He wasn't dead. And if he wasn't dead, then he was waiting. And if he was waiting, then she had to clear the path for him to come home. She finished her shift and walked to the mercantile. She didn't buy anything. She just lingered near the stove where the old-timers sat and gossiped. She had been asking quiet questions for weeks, piecing together the history of Silas Harper's rise to power. She heard a name mentioned again. Jonas. Used to be Silas's top hand. Old man Miller was saying. Until that accident. Horse fell on him, they say. Crushed his leg. Silas paid him off and sent him packing. Funny kind of accident. Another man wheezed. Jonas was the best rider in the county, and it happened right after the fires at the Circle K. Where is Jonas now? Maggie asked, stepping out from the aisle. The men looked at her, surprised. Mining town. Ma'am, Miller said, Silver Gulch, about 3 days' ride west. Heard he's living in a bottle. Maggie walked home, her mind racing. Jonas knew something. She felt it in her gut. Silas had a pattern, fires, accidents. Men who disappeared or were maimed just when they became inconvenient. If Jonas had been the foreman during the Circle K fires, maybe he knew how Silas operated. Maybe he knew about the hides. That night, she sat Jamie and Clara down. "I have to go away for a few days," she told them. Jamie looked up, his eyes huge in his thin face. "Are you going to find Eli?" "I'm going to find the truth, Jamie, and then Eli can come home." She took them to Mrs. Gable the next morning. The widow, whose conscience had perhaps been pricked by the town's cruelty, agreed to watch them for $1. Maggie saddled the old mare Eli had left behind. She packed a bedroll, a canteen, and a bag of dried meat. She put on her heaviest coat and tucked Eli's Colt Navy pistol into her saddlebag. She rode out of town without looking back, heading west toward the jagged peaks of the mountains. The journey was a nightmare. The wind never stopped. The plains were a vast, brown ocean of scrub and rock, empty of comfort. At night, she huddled by a small fire, listening to the yipping of coyotes that sounded like laughing children. She slept with a pistol in her hand, waking at every snap of a twig. On the second day, she saw dust on the horizon. 2 riders, they spotted her and altered course. Maggie watched them come, her heart thumping. They were drifters, rough men with unshaven faces and coats that looked like they had been stolen from the dead. "Well now," the lead rider said, pulling up his horse 10 yards away. He grinned, revealing gaps in his teeth. "A little bird, all alone out here." "You lost, darlin'?" "I am not lost," Maggie said. Her voice was steady, though her knees were shaking against the saddle. "I am meeting my husband." "Husband?" The man looked around the empty prairie. "I don't see no husband. I see a horse that looks tired, and saddlebags that might have something worth taking, and a woman who looks like she could use some company." He nudged his horse forward. Maggie didn't hesitate. She pulled the heavy Colt from the bag and leveled it at his chest. She cocked the hammer. The click was loud in the silence. "Another step and I will put a hole in you the size of a dinner plate," she said. The man pulled up, surprised. "Whoa there, little lady. That's a lot of gun for a small hand. My husband is just over that ridge." Maggie lied, nodding her head back. "Eli Kane. Maybe you have heard of him? He is riding with 6 men from the Harper Ranch. They will be here in 2 minutes. She saw the flicker of doubt in the man's eyes. The name Kane meant nothing to him, but the mention of 6 riders and the steadiness of her aim gave him pause. "We don't want no trouble," the second man muttered. "Let's go, Jack." The first man glared at her, measuring the distance, measuring her resolve. He saw the white-knuckled grip on the gun and the blaze in her green eyes. He decided the horse wasn't worth the bullet. "You got a guardian angel, lady," he spat. They wheeled their horses and rode off to the south. Maggie kept the gun raised until they were dots on the horizon. Then she lowered it, her entire body beginning to tremble violently. She dry-heaved over the side of the saddle, the terror finally catching up with her. "I wish you were here," she whispered to the empty air. "God, Eli, I wish you were here." She reached Silver Gulch the next afternoon. It was a festering sore of a town clinging to the side of a canyon. The air tasted of sulfur and coal smoke. The noise was constant, the stamp mills crushing ore, the shouts of miners, the braying of mules. She found Jonas in the 3rd saloon she checked. He was slumped at a table in the back, nursing a glass of rot-gut whiskey. He was a wreck of a man, his face gray with rock dust, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle under the table. "Mr. Jonas?" Maggie asked. He looked up, his eyes bleary and red-rimmed. "Who's asking?" "I am Maggie Kane, Eli Kane's wife." Jonas flinched. He looked around the saloon nervously. "I don't know you. Go away. I need to talk to you about Silas Harper," Maggie said, sitting down opposite him. Jonas laughed, a hacking sound that ended in a cough. "Talk about the devil and he appears?" "Girl, I ain't talking about Harper. I like breathing. Silas tried to destroy my husband," Maggie said. "He framed him for rustling. He burned our shed. He ran Eli off. Jonas took a long pull of his drink. Silas destroys everyone eventually. That's his nature." "He destroyed you, didn't he?" Jonas slammed the glass down. "It wasn't an accident," he hissed, leaning forward. He told me to burn out the Circle K, said they were stealing his grass. I told him I wasn't an arsonist. 2 days later, my cinch snaps while I'm riding a breaker. Cinch was cut. I know it. If you know it, then help me, Maggie said. Come back to Dry Creek. Tell the sheriff. The sheriff? Jonas scoffed. The sheriff is in Silas's pocket? If I go back there, I'm a dead man. Eli is innocent, Maggie said, and Silas is winning. Are you going to let him win forever? Are you going to sit here and drink until the dust kills you, knowing you let a good man take the fall for a crime Silas committed? Jonas stared at her. He saw the desperation in her face, but also the steel. You're a fool, Mrs. Kane, he muttered. Maybe, Maggie said, but I am not a coward. She stayed in Silver Gulch for 3 days. She brought him food. She sat with him while he drank, gently taking the bottle away when he had had enough. She told him about Eli, about the fence he built, the way he treated her brother, the way he had saved her from her own shame. Finally, on the 4th morning, Jonas hobbled out of the boarding house. He carried a canvas sack. I got a mule, he grunted. He's slow, but he walks. You'll come? Maggie asked, hope surging. I'm dying anyway, Jonas said, spitting black phlegm into the dirt. Doc says the lungs are petrified. Might as well die doing something that pisses Silas Harper off. 500 miles north, the cattle drive had ended. The herd was sold. The men were paid. Sutter, the trail boss, clapped Eli on the shoulder. You're a good hand. Clay, I've got a job for you on the return trip. Steady wages. Or I can recommend you to a ranch in Montana. Eli stood holding his pay, $200 in gold coin. It was enough to buy a lawyer, enough to survive the winter. He looked north, toward Montana and anonymity. Then he looked south. 2 days ago, they had crossed the Platte River. The water was swollen with melt. A young rider had gone under, horse and all. Eli had dove in without thinking, fighting the current, dragging the boy to the bank, as he lay gasping on the mud, the boy coughing up water beside him. Eli had realized something. He had fought the river with everything he had because he wanted to live. He didn't want to fade away. He didn't want to be a memory. He looked at Sutter. I thank you for the offer, Eli said, but I have to go south. South? There ain't nothing south but snow and trouble this time of year. My wife is south, Eli said, and I've been gone too long. He bought a fresh horse, a big roan with a deep chest. He bought a new Winchester rifle and enough ammunition to fight a small war. He rode out that afternoon, pushing the pace. He rode like a man chasing a fire. He crossed the mountain passes where the snow was belly deep on the horse. He slept 4 hours a night. He ate in the saddle. The closer he got to the territory, the heavier the dread became. Was she still there? Had Silas taken the house? Had she given up on him? He stopped in a small canyon town called Rocky Ridge, just 2 days' ride from Dry Creek, to water his horse. He walked into the saloon to buy a bottle of whiskey for the cold. 2 men were standing at the bar, laughing. Did you see that odd pair on the trail? One asked. A red-headed woman and a cripple on a mule. Yeah, the other said. Feisty little thing. I heard her telling the hostler she was heading to Dry Creek. Said the cripple has dirt on Silas Harper. Said they were going to hang the devil with his own rope. Eli froze. The bottle in his hand clattered to the bar. Red hair. Eli grabbed the man's arm, spinning him around. Was she alone? The man blinked, startled by the giant who had just accosted him. Whoa, friend. Yeah, red hair. Pretty. But looked like she'd bitten a lemon. She was with an old guy, leg all twisted up. When? Eli demanded. When did you see them? Couple hours ago. They took the lower pass. Eli dropped the man's arm. He threw a coin on the bar and ran. Maggie. She had gone to find a witness. She was riding into a war zone with a crippled man, right into the teeth of Silas Harper's power. And the lower pass was bandit country. Eli vaulted onto his horse, driving his spurs into the roan's flanks. The horse squealed and bolted. The sky turned a sickly, bruised yellow as the afternoon wore on. The wind picked up, screaming through the canyon walls, carrying a wall of grit that blotted out the sun. Maggie pulled her scarf up over her nose. Keep moving! Jonas! She shouted over the wind. Jonas was struggling. His mule was balking at the stinging sand. I can't see the trail, he yelled back. We have to get to shelter. They were in a narrow cut of the canyon, walls of red rock rising on either side. Visibility dropped to 20 feet. The world was a swirling vortex of brown dust. Suddenly, shapes emerged from the haze ahead. 3 riders, blocking the path. Bandits. They had been tracking the slow-moving mule for miles, waiting for the storm to provide cover. Get down, a voice shouted. Maggie reached for the pistol in her saddlebag, but she was too slow. A rider spurred his horse alongside her, grabbing her reins. He yanked hard, pulling her horse's head down. Get off the horse, lady. Another rider knocked Jonas from his mule. The old man hit the ground with a cry of pain as his bad leg crumbled. Maggie lashed out with her riding crop, striking the bandit across the face. He swore and backhanded her. The blow knocked her hat off and dazed her. He grabbed her arm, dragging her half out of the saddle. You're coming with us, he growled. No! Maggie screamed, kicking at him. Suddenly, a sound cut through the roar of the wind. A thunderclap that wasn't thunder. A gunshot. The bandit holding Maggie jerked, his hat flying off his head as a bullet passed through the crown. He spun around. Out of the yellow haze, a rider appeared. He was coming at a dead gallop, a dark shape that looked like vengeance carved from the mountain itself. Eli didn't slow down. He rode straight into the bandit's horse, the collision sounding like a hammer hitting meat. The bandit's horse went down, throwing the man into the dirt. Eli leaped from his saddle while his horse was still moving. He hit the ground rolling and came up with the Winchester leveled. The second bandit, the one standing over Jonas, raised his pistol. Eli fired. He didn't aim. He pointed. The lever action clicked-clacked, and the bandit's gun arm shattered. He screamed and dropped the weapon. The third bandit, seeing the fury of the assault, wheeled his horse and fled into the blinding dust. Eli didn't chase him. He spun toward the man on the ground who had held Maggie. The bandit scrambled backward, crab-walking away from the barrel of the rifle. Get out! Eli roared. His voice was terrible, a sound torn from the bottom of his chest. Run! The bandit scrambled up and ran, disappearing into the storm. Silence returned, save for the howling wind. Maggie sat on her horse, frozen. Her cheek was throbbing where she had been hit. She stared at the man standing in the trail. He was covered in dust, bearded, wild-eyed, breathing like a steam engine. He looked terrifying, but then he lowered the rifle. He looked up at her. Maggie? He rasped. The wind snatched the name away, but she heard it. She slid from the saddle, her legs giving way as she hit the ground. Eli dropped the rifle. He crossed the distance in 3 long strides. He caught her before she fell. He pulled her into him, his arms wrapping around her with crushing force. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of dust and fear and her. I got you, he choked out. I got you. Maggie clung to him. She grabbed handfuls of his coat, pressing herself against the solid, undeniable reality of him. He was here. He was warm. He was shaking just as hard as she was. You came back, she sobbed against his chest. I told you, he whispered, his voice thick with tears. I told you I would come back. He pulled back just enough to look at her face. He touched the red mark on her cheek with a trembling finger. His eyes went dark, dangerous, but then they softened as they searched hers. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of grit and blood and salt tears. It was a collision of months of longing, of anger, of forgiveness. It was a seal on a promise kept. They broke apart, gasping for air. Jonas groaned from the ground. I hate to interrupt the reunion, he wheezed, but my leg is on fire, and this dust is killing me. Eli looked over. He didn't know the man, but he saw Maggie move toward him. This is Jonas, Maggie said, wiping her eyes. He is our witness. Eli, he knows about the fire. He knows about the hides. Eli looked at the crippled man, then back at his wife. He saw the fierce determination in her jaw, the way she stood tall despite the exhaustion. She hadn't just waited. She had gone to war for him. A fierce pride swelled in his chest, so big it almost hurt. "Let's get to cover," Eli said. They found a dilapidated line shack a mile down the canyon. It had 3 walls and a leaky roof, but it was out of the wind. They built a fire in the stone hearth. Jonas passed out in the corner, exhausted by the pain in the whiskey he had brought. Maggie and Eli sat by the fire. Eli cleaned the cut on her cheek. Maggie trimmed his beard with her sewing scissors, revealing the face she had missed so desperately. "Why did you run?" she asked quietly, her fingers tracing the scar on his arm. "Because I was afraid they would kill me," Eli admitted. "But mostly, I was afraid that if I stayed, I would just be one more thing you had to survive." Maggie took his hand. "You are not a burden, Eli. You are my husband. And you," Eli said, shaking his head in wonder. "You rode into Silver Gulch alone. You faced down bandits." "I had to," she said simply. "I wasn't going to let them win." Eli pulled her into his lap. He held her there as the storm raged outside, the firelight flickering on their faces. "We're going back," he said, "to Dry Creek. Yes, they'll be waiting. Silas will be waiting." "Let him wait," Maggie said, resting her head on his shoulder. "We have the truth now, and we have each other." Eli kissed the top of her head. He looked into the fire, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a man running from his past. He felt like a man riding toward his future. The storm broke just before dawn. The sky cleared to a brilliant, piercing blue. They rode out 3 abreast, Eli, Maggie, and Jonas on his mule. They rode toward the sunrise, toward the town that had scorned them, toward the man who wanted to destroy them. Eli reached out and took Maggie's hand. She squeezed it back, their fingers laced together, a knot that would not slip. They were ready. Dry Creek was waking up to spring, but the thaw had not yet reached the hearts of its people. The cottonwoods along the riverbank were putting out tentative green shoots, and the mud in the main street was thick and sucking, churning under the wheels of wagons heading toward the white steeple of the church. The air smelled of wet earth and new grass, a deceptive sweetness that masked the tension coiling tight beneath the surface of the town. It was Sunday morning. The bells were tolling, a metallic clangor that rolled out across the prairie, summoning the righteous and the repentant. They rode in just as the second bell began to ring. It was a sight that stopped conversations mid-sentence on the boardwalk. Eli Kane rode a big roan horse, sitting tall and grim, his beard trimmed but his face hard as granite. Beside him, on a mare that looked too small for the muddy road, sat Maggie. Her chin was lifted so high it looked painful, her face pale but set with a terrifying resolve. Trailing behind them on a mule was Jonas, the crippled former ranch hand. Looking like a ghost dragged unwillingly back to the land of the living, they did not sneak in the back way. They did not hug the shadows of the alleys. They rode straight down the center of the main street, the mud spattering the hem of Maggie's dress and the legs of Eli's trousers. Eli glanced at her. He wanted to tell her to turn back. He wanted to shield her from the stares that felt like physical blows. But Maggie had been clear the night before, sitting by the fire in the line shack. "We do not hide," she had said. "The truth deserves the sunlight." They dismounted in front of the church. The hitching rail was crowded, but men moved their animals aside when they saw Eli approach. It was not out of respect. It was out of a primal recognition of danger. Eli moved with a coiled energy, his hand brushing the stock of the Winchester in his scabbard before he turned to help Maggie down. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Maggie smoothed her skirts. Her hands were trembling, but her voice was not. "Yes." They walked up the steps, Jonas limping heavily behind them, leaning on a makeshift crutch. The doors were open. The preacher, Reverend Thomas, was standing at the pulpit, shuffling his notes. The pews were full. Silas Harper was not there. He rarely attended, preferring to worship his own reflection. But his wife sat in the front row, a stiff, severe woman in black silk, surrounded by the foreman and several ranch hands who served as Silas's eyes and ears. Maggie and Eli walked into the sanctuary. The sound of their boots on the floorboards was loud in the sudden silence. Heads turned. A ripple of whispering broke out, sounding like dry leaves skittering over stone. A woman in the third pew gasped audibly and pulled her skirts away as Maggie passed, as if shame were a contagious disease. Reverend Thomas looked up. He adjusted his spectacles, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "Mr. Kane," the Reverend stammered. "Mrs. Kane, we were not expecting you. We are here to worship." "Reverend," Eli said, his voice deep and carrying to the back of the room. "And to speak." "To speak?" The Reverend looked nervous. He glanced at Mrs. Harper, who was staring straight ahead with icy disapproval. "This is a house of God, Mr. Kane, not a town hall. God knows the truth," Maggie said, stepping forward. Her voice shook, thin and brittle, but it grew stronger with the second word. It is time his people heard it too. She let go of Eli's arm and walked to the front of the church. She stood before the altar, turning to face the congregation. She saw the faces she had known for years, Mrs. Gable, the sheriff, the shopkeeper who had sneered at her credit. She saw the judgment etched into their features, the comfortable self-righteousness of people who believe they are better than the sinner standing before them. "For 3 years, Maggie began, and the room froze. A woman speaking from the front of the church was unheard of. "For 3 years, you have whispered about me. You have said I'm a fallen woman. You have said I led Silas Harper into a barn and then cried wolf when I did not get what I wanted." She took a breath. "I was 19. I went to deliver a blanket. Silas Harper cornered me. He blocked the door. He told me that a girl with debt and no father had no right to say no to a man who owned half the valley." She looked directly at Mrs. Harper. "He tore my dress. He put his hands on me. And when I fought him, when I scratched his face and kicked him, he laughed. He called me a liar before I ever opened my mouth. And you, all of you, you believed him. Because he has money. Because he has a fine house. And I was just Maggie, the seamstress with a sick brother." A murmur of outrage started in the back, but Maggie raised her voice, cutting through it. "And then I married Eli Kane. And you laughed. You called him a gelding. You repeated the lie that he was not man enough to please a woman." She looked at Eli, who was standing by the door. His eyes locked on hers. "You mocked him because he has a scar on his soul where his first wife broke his heart. You mocked him because on his wedding night, years ago, he refused to force himself on a terrified girl who had been taught to fear a man's touch. He walked away to save her dignity, and she paid him back with a lie." Tears pricked Maggie's eyes, but she did not wipe them away. "Eli Kane is a man of honor," she said fiercely. "He took me in when none of you would lift a finger to help me. He worked his hands raw to feed my family, and in the dark, in the privacy of our home. He treated me with a kindness and a gentleness that healed the parts of me Silas Harper tried to destroy." She took a step closer to the pews. "He did not fail me. He loved me. He loved me enough to let me be safe. He loved me enough to prove that a man's strength is not in what he takes, but in what he protects." The silence was absolute. Even the babies were quiet. The truth of her words, delivered with such raw, bleeding honesty, hung in the air like smoke. Then, a man in the back, one of Silas's riders, stood up. "She's lying!" he shouted. "She's lying to save a rustler!" Maggie pointed to the door. "Jonas!" The crippled man hobbled forward. The sound of his crutch thumping against the wood was a rhythmic accusation. He stopped beside Maggie. He looked terrible, gaunt, shaking, smelling of old liquor, but his eyes were clear. "I ain't lying," Jonas rasped. The sheriff stood up from his pew. "Jonas, you're drunk. Sit down before I lock you up. I might be drunk." "Sheriff," Jonas said, "but I was there. I was foreman at the Circle K when the fire started. Silas ordered me to burn that feed. He ordered me to cut the fence. That's slander. Mrs. Harper shrieked, jumping to her feet. "And the night Eli's shed burned?" Jonas continued, his voice rising. "I saw Silas's men riding back from the Kane place. I saw them laughing about the bonfire. And those hides you found, Silas had 3 steers butchered in the ravine behind his own house 2 nights before. I saw the carcasses. He had them planted to frame Eli." The sheriff pushed his way out of the pew, his face red. "That is enough. I won't have a known drunkard spreading lies about a respected citizen." Jonas looked the sheriff in the eye. "I am a drunkard because I was too much of a coward to say no to him." Jonas said softly, "He had my leg crushed to shut me up, but I ain't afraid anymore. Sheriff, a man gets tired of carrying the devil's water." The church erupted. Arguments broke out in the aisles. People were standing, shouting, pointing fingers. The veneer of Dry Creek's polite society cracked open, revealing the rot underneath. Eli walked forward then. He moved through the chaos like a ship cutting through rough water. He took Maggie's hand. He nodded to Jonas. "We have said our piece," Eli said. They turned to leave. As they stepped out onto the porch, the bright spring sunlight was blinding. But looking down the street, they saw the darkness coming. Silas Harper was riding toward the church. He had heard. News in a small town travels faster than light, and one of his men must have slipped out the back. Silas rode a black stallion, flanked by 3 men. He pulled up in the middle of the street, 20 yards from the church steps. He looked immaculate in a gray suit, his silver hair shining, his face a mask of cold fury. The congregation poured out of the church, spilling onto the steps and the dusty street, eager for the spectacle. "Cain!" Silas shouted. Eli let go of Maggie's hand. "Stay here," he whispered. He walked down the steps, his boots heavy on the wood. He stopped in the street, standing alone against the 4 riders. "You have a loose tongue, Eli," Silas called out, "and a lying wife. I hear you have been spreading filth in the Lord's house. I spoke the truth." "Silas," Eli said calmly, "and the truth has a way of sticking." Silas laughed, but it was a brittle sound. "You are a rustler and a coward who ran away. And now you come back here and slander my name. I should have the sheriff hang you right now." The sheriff had pushed his way to the front of the crowd. He looked from Jonas to Maggie to Silas. He saw the doubt in the eyes of the townsfolk. He saw the way the wind was changing. I think we need to look into these claims, Mr. Harper," the sheriff said weakly. Silas turned his cold eyes on the lawman. "You will do as you are paid to do, Miller, or you will be replaced." He looked back at Eli. "There is no law here but what we make." Silas said, "You want to clear your name? You want to prove you are a man?" Silas dismounted. He handed his reins to one of his men. He threw back the sides of his coat, revealing the pearl-handled revolver on his hip. "Man to man," Silas said, "here and now. Or are you going to hide behind your wife's skirts again?" The air crackled. The crowd held its breath. This was the West. This was how arguments ended when words failed. Eli looked at Silas. He looked at the gun. He looked at the man who had tormented his wife, who had burned his home, who had tried to steal his dignity. Eli unbuttoned his coat. He swept it back. He wore the old Colt Navy on his hip, the leather worn and dark with sweat. "I am not hiding. Silas." Silas smiled. It was a cruel, confident smile. He was known to be fast. He practiced shooting glass bottles off fence rails at 50 paces. He believed in his own legend. "Step out then," Silas said. Eli took 2 steps forward. He stood relaxed, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. He wasn't thinking about speed. He was thinking about the wind. He was thinking about the angle of the sun. He was thinking about Maggie, standing on the steps behind him, her heart beating in time with his. "Draw!" Silas screamed. Silas's hand moved in a blur. It was fast, incredibly fast. He cleared leather before Eli had even gripped his gun. Bang! Silas fired. The bullet tore through the sleeve of Eli's coat, grazing the skin of his upper arm. A line of fire seared across his flesh. Eli did not flinch. He did not rush. His hand moved with the fluid. Practiced economy of a soldier. He drew the Colt, leveled it, and cocked the hammer in one smooth motion. Silas was cocking his gun for a second shot, a look of surprise crossing his face that he hadn't dropped the big man. Bang! Eli's shot was a thunderclap. The bullet hit Silas Harper squarely in the center of his chest. Silas jerked backward as if he had been kicked by a mule. His gun flew from his hand. He took one staggering step back, his mouth opening in a silent O of shock, and then he collapsed into the red dust of the street. He lay still, his fine gray suit turning dark with blood, the dust settling on his polished boots. For 10 seconds, there was no sound but the wind. Then, the sheriff ran forward. He knelt beside Silas, checked for a pulse, and stood up. He looked at Eli, then at the crowd. "Self-defense!" the sheriff shouted, his voice cracking. "You all saw it. Harper drew first. It was self-defense." The tension broke. A collective exhale swept through the town. Silas Harper, the king of Dry Creek, was dead. The man who owned the water, the land, and the law was just a body in the dirt. Eli holstered his gun. He pressed his hand over the tear in his sleeve, feeling the warm stickiness of blood. Maggie ran down the steps. She didn't care about the blood or the body. She threw herself at Eli, wrapping her arms around his waist, burying her face in his chest. Eli held her. He looked over the top of her head at the townspeople. They were staring at him, but the look had changed. It wasn't hatred anymore. It was fear, mixed with a grudging, stunned respect. "Let's go home," Eli whispered. The charges were dropped before the sun set, with Silas dead and Jonas's testimony echoing in everyone's ears. The sheriff found his moral compass, or at least his sense of self-preservation. He declared the investigation into the rustling closed due to new evidence. There was no apology. The West did not apologize. It simply moved on. Maggie and Eli returned to the cabin as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and orange. The cabin was cold. The blackened remains of the shed still smelled of char, but it was theirs. They began the work of rebuilding not with words, but with their hands. Eli stripped the burned timbers from the shed. He bought new lumber with the gold he had brought from the trail. He restacked the woodpile, chopping with a rhythm that echoed through the valley. Maggie scrubbed the cabin floor. She aired out the quilts. She planted the garden again, turning the soil, putting seeds into the earth with a fierce hope. Slowly, the ice in the town began to thaw. It wasn't a sudden embrace. It was small, quiet gestures. A week after the shooting, a neighbor, Mr. Henderson, stopped his wagon at their gate. "I have some extra fence posts," he mumbled, not meeting Eli's eyes. "Thought you might use them. Since the fire." Eli took them. "I appreciate it." Henderson. 2 days later, Maggie found a basket on the porch. Inside were 2 jars of peach preserves and a loaf of bread, wrapped in a cloth that she recognized as Mrs. Gable's work. There was no note. There didn't need to be. It was a peace offering. It was an admission that they had been wrong. On Sundays, when they went to church, the aisle did not clear quite so fast. The Reverend nodded to them. A few women offered hesitant smiles. They were not fully one of them. They would always be the couple that defied the natural order, the strong woman and the quiet man, but they were no longer outcasts. They were survivors. Summer turned to autumn, and the cottonwoods turned gold. One evening, Maggie sat by the fire, mending a pair of Eli's trousers. She set her needle down and looked at her husband. He was oiling his boots, the firelight casting deep shadows on his face. "Eli," she said. He looked up. "Yeah, I have to tell you something." Something in her voice made him set the boot down. He turned fully toward her. "I'm late," she said. Eli blinked. "Late for what?" Maggie smiled. A soft, terrified, joyful smile. "My monthly bleeding. It hasn't come. Not since you came back." Eli stared at her. His eyes went to her stomach, flat beneath her apron. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "A baby," he whispered. Maggie nodded. "A baby." Eli sat back in his chair. He ran a hand over his face. He felt a rush of joy so intense it made him dizzy, followed immediately by a crashing wave of fear. A father. He was going to be a father. He looked at his hands, scarred, calloused, hands that had killed a man in the street. He thought of his own father, a hard man who spoke with a belt. He thought of the rumors that had dogged him for so many years. "Can I do it?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Maggie." I don't know. I don't know how to be a father. What if I'm too hard? What if I'm broken? Maggie moved from her chair. She knelt beside him, taking his large hands in hers. Look at me, Elijah Kane. He looked at her. You are the man who built a home for a woman everyone else threw away. She said, you are the man who sat with a sick boy and carved him a horse. You are the man who held me when I was crying and didn't ask for a thing. She pressed his hand against her belly. You are not broken. She whispered, you are the strongest man I know, because you are gentle. That is what this child needs. Not a gunman. Just you. Eli leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. He closed his eyes, breathing in her scent. The fear didn't vanish, but the anchor of her belief held him steady. A baby. He murmured again. A little one. Their intimacy changed in the months that followed. It became something sacred. When they lay together in the dark, Eli touched her with a reverence that made Maggie want to weep. He was careful, protective, his hands mapping the changes in her body as if he were memorizing a new country. He wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. He wasn't fighting a rumor. He was loving his wife and the life they had made together. November brought the storms again. One night, a year almost to the day since they had married, a gale swept down from the mountains. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cabin in stark bursts of white light. Thunder rolled across the prairie, shaking the floorboards. Rain hammered the roof like 1,000 fists. Inside, the fire was roaring. The lamp cast a warm, golden glow. They sat on the rug before the hearth. Maggie rested her head on Eli's shoulder. His arm was around her, his hand spread wide over the swell of her belly, where the child kicked against his palm. It's like our wedding night, Maggie murmured, watching the flames. Eli tightened his hold on her. I remember. I was so scared that night. Scared of what? Scared you would see me, he said softly. Scared you would look at me and see what the town saw. A failure. Maggie turned her head to kiss his jaw. I looked at you and saw a refuge. Eli was quiet for a long time. The wind howled outside, a lonely, searching sound. That night in the shed, he said, his voice low, when the fire started. When I ran, yes, I wasn't afraid of dying. Maggie, I've faced death before. He turned to look at her, his gray eyes shining in the firelight. I was afraid of losing you. I was afraid that if I swung from that rope, there would be no one left to stand between you and the world. That's why I ran. To come back. To be the wall. Maggie reached up and touched his face, tracing the line of his cheekbone, the beard that scratched her skin. You are the wall, she whispered, and you are the door, and you are the fire. She shifted, moving to kiss him. It was a slow kiss, tasting of peace and promises kept. Come to bed, she whispered against his lips. They stood up, the firelight stretching their shadows tall against the logs. They moved to the bed in the corner, the bed that had once been a battleground of fear and was now an altar of peace. They lay down together as the storm raged outside. The wind tore at the shutters. The rain tried to find a way in. The world was still dangerous. The West was still wild, unforgiving, and cruel. Silas Harper was gone. But there would be other storms, other droughts, other hard winters. But as Eli pulled the quilt over them, drawing Maggie's back against his chest, his hand resting on their unborn child, none of that mattered. They had survived the fire. They had survived the lies. They had survived the distance. Rumors would fade, money would come and go. But this, the heat of their bodies in the dark, the steady beat of two hearts that had learned to beat in time, this was stone. This was iron. They closed their eyes, safe in the home they had carved out of the unkind land, and let the storm blow itself out. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope the journey of Maggie and Eli resonated with you. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from. Please leave a comment below sharing your location. If you enjoyed this tale of resilience and romance on the American frontier, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories like this one. I invite you to share your thoughts on the ending in English in the comments section. Your feedback means the world to me,